The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone understood why, and the entire hall of Blackthorn Manor went still. Elena Voss stood with her hand still raised from the toss, her lips curled into a small, satisfied smile, as if breaking crystal in front of 200 guests was nothing more than a passing amusement. Damien Cross, seated at the head table, did not move. He did not even blink. His eyes, the color of wet slate, followed the shards as they scattered near the feet of an old man sitting quietly in the corner, a man most of the guests had walked past without a second glance all evening. "Watch where you step, old-timer," Elena said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, waving a hand toward the elderly man, as though he were furniture that had been placed in her way. "This is an engagement dinner, not a shelter for tired staff." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Someone at the far end of the room cleared his throat too quickly, the sound of a person trying to smooth over something that should never have happened. The old man, dressed in a plain gray coat far too simple for the diamonds and silk filling the hall, only smiled. He bent down, slow and unbothered, and began gathering the broken glass himself, piece by piece, as if he had all the time in the world and nothing to prove to anyone in that room. Damien's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign that something inside him had shifted. His best friend and second-in-command, Nathan Hale, leaned toward him from the neighboring chair, voice low enough that only Damien could hear. "You want me to handle that?" Nathan asked, his hand already halfway off the table. "No," Damien said quietly. "Let it happen." Nathan frowned, confused, but said nothing more. He had known Damien since they were boys running through the training yards of the Blackthorn compound, since long before either of them understood what it meant to carry the weight of an entire pack empire on their shoulders. He knew Damien's silences were rarely empty. There was always a reason, even when the reason was hidden 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. The engagement between Damien Cross and Elena Voss had been announced only 2 months earlier, though the arrangement itself had been years in the making. The Cross family controlled the largest network of pack territories across the eastern region, an empire built on trade routes, alliances, and a council seat that had been passed down for 4 generations. The Voss family, meanwhile, held influence over trade and finance that stretched far beyond wolf circles, into human markets that most packs were too proud or too frightened to touch. A union between the two families was, on paper, a masterstroke, power joining power, wealth meeting wealth. But Damien had never been a man who trusted paper. From the moment the arrangement was finalized, he had insisted on one condition that his father, the aging Alpha Reginald Cross, had reluctantly agreed to. Before the wedding took place, Damien would be allowed to observe Elena without her knowing she was being tested. Not through spies, not through reports, through his own eyes, in ordinary moments, when a person's true nature tends to slip out from beneath the polish they wear in public. That was why the old man in the gray coat sat at tonight's dinner at all. His name, as far as most of the guests were concerned, was simply Alaric, an elderly relative of a minor pack family invited out of courtesy. Few people asked questions about him because few people found him interesting enough to ask. He kept to himself, ate quietly, spoke only when spoken to, and wore clothes that had clearly seen better decades. To Elena, and to most of the young, ambitious wolves filling the hall that night, he was simply background noise, an old relic from a world that had already moved past him. What none of them knew, except Damien and a small handful of people bound by discretion older than the Voss and Cross families combined, was that Alaric Thorne was not a minor relative of anyone. He was the last living founder of the Continental Pack Council, the very body whose blessing was required to confirm any new Alpha line as legitimate. Long before Damien's grandfather had built the first Blackthorn trade routes, Alaric Thorne had walked from territory to territory, settling disputes that would have otherwise ended in bloodshed, brokering peace between packs that had hated each other for 100 years. He had stepped back from public life decades ago, choosing to live simply, quietly, watching the world of pack politics from its edges rather than its center. Few young wolves even recognized his face anymore. That was exactly how he preferred it. Damien had personally written to him 3 months earlier, an old and careful letter delivered by hand rather than by any modern means, asking for a single favor: attend the engagement dinner as an ordinary guest, say nothing of who he truly was, and simply watch. "You want me to test the girl you're about to marry," Alaric had said when Damien visited him at his modest home near the northern hills, a home so plain it could have belonged to any retired shopkeeper. "I want to know who she is when she thinks no one important is watching," Damien had answered. "You're the only person I trust to see it clearly, and the only person she won't recognize." Alaric had studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that made even seasoned wolves shift their weight uneasily. and then he had simply nodded. Very well. But understand something, young Cross. I do not judge quickly, and I do not judge unfairly. If she is worthy, I will tell you so, and I will mean it. If she is not, he paused, folding his hands. You will not need me to tell you. You will already know. Damien had believed those words the moment Alaric spoke them. He believed them even more now, watching Elena brush glass shards toward the old man's shoes with the side of her expensive heel, as if he were simply another obstacle to be swept aside. Across the room, Elena's father, Victor Voss, raised his glass in a toast, oblivious or indifferent to the small scene his daughter had just created. Victor was a broad, confident man who had built his fortune by knowing exactly which doors to open and which to quietly close behind him. To him, this marriage was the greatest deal of his life, a permanent seat at the table of true pack power, and nothing, not even his daughter's occasional lapses in grace, was going to threaten it. To the union of two great houses, Victor announced, his voice booming through the hall. May the Cross and Voss names be spoken together for 100 years to come. The room erupted in applause. Elena beamed, lifting her own glass, playing the part of the radiant bride-to-be with practiced ease. She was undeniably striking, with sharp features and confident posture, the kind of woman who knew how to command a room simply by existing in it. But confidence, Damien had learned over the years, was not the same as character. Some people were confident because they had built something worth being proud of. Others were confident simply because no one had ever told them no. As the applause faded and the orchestra resumed its quiet, elegant music, Elena made her way toward Damien, weaving gracefully between tables, accepting compliments and congratulations as she passed. When she finally reached him, she slid into the seat beside his with a satisfied sigh, resting a manicured hand on his arm. "Did you see that old man's face when I told him to move?" she said, laughing softly under her breath. "Honestly, someone should tell whoever's in charge of the guest list to be more careful. This is supposed to be an elegant evening, not a retirement gathering." Damien turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. "He's a guest," he said simply, "like everyone else here." Elena waved a dismissive hand, clearly unbothered by the mild correction. Of course, I didn't mean anything by it. I just don't understand why families invite half these people. It's not like they matter to anyone important." She smiled, leaning closer. "Besides, tonight isn't about him. It's about us." Damien said nothing. He simply watched as, across the room, Alaric finished gathering the last of the broken glass, handed it quietly to a passing server with a polite nod, and returned to his seat as though nothing at all had happened. There was no anger in the old man's expression, no wounded pride. Only a calm, patient stillness, the kind that belonged to someone who had seen far too much of the world to be shaken by the carelessness of a young woman who did not yet understand who she had just insulted. Nathan leaned toward Damien again once Elena had drifted off to greet another cluster of guests, her laughter trailing behind her like perfume. "She really has no idea, does she?" "No," Damien said. "She doesn't." "You're not going to tell her?" Damien's gaze remained fixed on Alaric across the room, who had, at that exact moment, glanced up and met Damien's eyes with the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. A silent understanding passed between them, one that needed no words. The test had begun. "Not yet," Damien said quietly. "Let her show me who she really is first. If I tell her who he is now, she'll simply learn to hide it better." "I don't want her to learn how to hide it. I want to see it." Nathan studied his friend for a long moment, the way he had 100 times before during difficult decisions, battles, negotiations, moments when the fate of entire territories had rested on Damien's judgment. He had learned over the years that questioning Damien's patience rarely ended in anything but proof that the patience had been justified all along. "And if she keeps this up?" Nathan asked. "If she keeps treating him like this?" Damien's expression did not change, but something in his voice grew colder, quieter, more certain. "Then she will make the mistake that ends everything, and she will make it in front of the one person whose opinion can never be undone. And when that happens," he said, finally turning his gaze away from Alaric, and toward the dance floor where Elena now spun gracefully in the arms of one of her cousins, laughing without a single thought for the old man she had humiliated twice in one evening, "I will already know exactly what to do." The music swelled, the guests danced. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm golden light across silk gowns and tailored suits, and from the outside, it looked like nothing more than a joyful celebration of two powerful families joining as one. But at the head table, Damien Cross sat perfectly still, watching his bride laugh her way through the evening, counting, quietly and without a single visible sign, The small cruelties she did not yet know were being witnessed by someone who could end her future with a single word. Somewhere near the edge of the hall, Alaric Thorne poured himself a modest glass of water, settled back into his corner seat, and continued to watch, exactly as he had promised he would. Later that night, once the last of the guests had wandered off into waiting cars, and the musicians had packed away their instruments, Damien walked the empty halls of the manor alone. His father, Reginald Cross, found him standing at the tall windows overlooking the training yard, hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching nothing in particular. "You were quiet tonight," Reginald said, stepping beside his son. Age had slowed him, but it had not dulled the sharpness in his eyes, the same sharpness that had kept the Cross family at the top of pack politics for 4 generations. "I was watching," Damien said. "Your bride seemed to enjoy herself." "She did." Reginald studied his son's profile for a moment, the way fathers sometimes do when they sense there is more beneath a simple answer than the words themselves reveal. "You asked for this arrangement with Alaric because you wanted proof, not promises. Have you found any yet?" "Not proof," Damien admitted. "Just a beginning." "And if the beginning is a poor one?" Damien turned from the window at last, his expression calm in the way that unsettled people far more than anger ever could. "Then I will let her walk the rest of the path on her own, and I will watch where it leads." A person who is cruel to someone she believes holds no power over her will always be far crueler to someone she believes holds power over her. Tonight was simply the first test. There will be more. Reginald allowed a small, knowing smile to cross his weathered face. It was the same expression he had worn decades earlier, back when he himself had been a young alpha heir, learning that strength was rarely proven through grand gestures, but through the countless small choices a person made, when they believed no one of consequence was paying attention. "Your grandfather used to say something similar," he said. "He believed you could learn everything about a person's character by watching how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return." "I remember," Damien said quietly. "He told me the same thing when I was 12. And do you believe it?" Damien's gaze drifted back toward the darkened training yard, though his thoughts were clearly elsewhere, back in the golden light of the hall, back to the sound of shattering glass, and the sight of an old man calmly gathering the pieces without complaint. "I believe it more tonight than I ever have before," he said. Reginald placed a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, the closest thing to reassurance the old alpha ever offered. "Then trust your instincts, as you always have. But be careful, Damien. Alaric Thorne's opinion carries more weight than any council vote, any trade agreement, any alliance we have ever built. If Elena continues down this road and he witnesses enough of it, there will be no argument, no apology, and no amount of Voss family fortune that can undo what she has done. Some mistakes cannot be repaired. They can only be avoided." "I know," Damien said. "That's exactly why I'm watching so closely." Reginald nodded once, satisfied, and left his son standing alone at the window. Down in the yard, the wind moved gently through the tall grass, and somewhere far beyond the manor walls, the quiet hum of the sleeping city carried faintly on the night air. Damien remained there long after his father's footsteps had faded down the corridor, turning the events of the evening over in his mind, replaying the small, careless cruelty in Elena's voice, the calm patience in Alaric's expression, the silent nod they had shared across the crowded hall. He was not angry, not yet. Anger, he had learned long ago, was a poor advisor, quick to cloud judgment and blind a person to details that mattered far more than a single moment of frustration. What he felt instead was something steadier, something closer to certainty settling quietly into place, brick by brick, the way a foundation forms long before anyone can see the shape of the building that will eventually rise above it. Elena had made her first mistake tonight, and she did not even know it had been witnessed by the one man capable of ending everything she believed she had just secured. She would make more mistakes. Damien was almost certain of it. People who behaved as she had rarely stopped after a single evening, especially when no one appeared to notice or care. He intended to keep noticing. He intended to keep watching. And when the moment finally came, when Elena made the mistake so large it could no longer be dismissed, laughed away, or smoothed over with a practiced smile, Damien would be ready. Not with rage, not with cruelty of his own, but with quiet, patient certainty, the same certainty his father and grandfather had carried before him, the certainty of a man who understood that true strength was rarely loud, and the biggest mistakes were rarely made all at once. They were built, quietly, one small cruelty at a time, exactly like the one he had just watched unfold in front of 200 unsuspecting guests. The dinner was only the beginning. 3 days after the engagement dinner, Elena stood in the middle of the manor's east wing, arms crossed, directing a small army of decorators with the confidence of someone who had already decided exactly how her wedding would look, down to the last flower petal. She wanted white orchids, not lilies. She wanted the aisle runner replaced because the shade of ivory was, in her words, too yellow to photograph well. She wanted the seating chart redone twice in one afternoon, because 2 families she disliked had been placed too close to the head table. Charlotte Reeve, Elena's closest friend since childhood, and now her unofficial wedding coordinator, trailed behind her with a tablet clutched to her chest, nodding along to each new demand while quietly wondering how many more changes the exhausted staff could handle before someone simply quit. "You're being a little intense today," Charlotte said carefully, once the decorators had scattered to handle the latest round of instructions. "I'm being thorough," Elena corrected. "There's a difference. This wedding isn't just my wedding, Charlotte. It's a statement. Every noble family in the region is going to be watching, and I intend for them to walk away remembering exactly who Elena Voss is. They already know who you are. They know who my father is," Elena said, a flicker of something sharper crossing her expression. "After this wedding, they'll know who I am. Not Victor Voss's daughter, not just Damien Cross's wife, Elena Cross, someone who matters in her own right." Charlotte said nothing further, though her eyes lingered a moment longer than usual on her friend's face, the way one does when noticing a hunger that seems, lately, to be growing sharper by the day. Down the hall, unnoticed by either of them, Alaric Thorne moved slowly past an open doorway, a folder of old ledgers tucked beneath his arm. He had been given a small guest room in the manor's quieter wing for the length of his stay, a courtesy Damien had arranged under the pretense that the old family friend preferred peace and distance from the noise of wedding preparations. In truth, it placed him close enough to observe the household's daily rhythms without drawing attention to himself. He was making his way toward the manor's private library, a room few of the younger staff bothered to enter, when Elena's voice rang out behind him, sharp and impatient. "Excuse me. You there?" Alaric turned, unhurried, meeting her gaze with the same calm patience he had shown at the dinner 3 nights earlier. "I need someone to move these boxes of table linens down to the storage room before this afternoon," Elena said, gesturing toward a stack of crates near the corridor's end, without so much as glancing at his face. "And be careful with them. They cost more than most people's monthly wages." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. "Elena, I don't think he's—" "It's fine," Elena said, waving a dismissive hand. "He's clearly not doing anything important. Look at him. He's probably one of the caretaker's relatives helping out for the week." She finally turned her full attention to Alaric, offering him the kind of tight, impatient smile people give when they believe they are being generous simply by acknowledging someone's existence. "It won't take you long. Just move them and you can go back to whatever you were doing." Alaric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before offering a small, polite nod. "Of course," he said simply, setting his folder of ledgers on a nearby table. He walked toward the crates without protest, without a single word of correction, and began carrying them, one by one, toward the storage room exactly as instructed. Charlotte waited until Elena had turned the corner, before hurrying after Alaric, guilt written plainly across her face. "I'm so sorry," she said, reaching for one of the crates herself. "You really don't have to do this. Let me help, or better yet, let me find someone from the staff." "It's quite all right," Alaric said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "I don't mind the work. An old body benefits from a bit of exercise now and then." He smiled faintly, setting the crate down with practiced ease despite his age. "Besides, I find it rather interesting to see how people behave when they believe a simple task is beneath them to perform themselves." Charlotte blinked, unsure how to respond to that, though something in his tone left her feeling oddly exposed, as if he had seen far more in the last few minutes than she was entirely comfortable with. That evening, Damien found Alaric in the manor's private library exactly where he expected him to be, seated near the tall windows with a cup of tea cooling untouched beside him, a book open on his lap that he did not appear to be reading. "I heard about the crates," Damien said, closing the door quietly behind him. "News travels quickly in this house," Alaric replied, not looking up. "Nathan mentioned it. He wasn't pleased." "Your friend has good instincts," Alaric said. He recognized the disrespect for what it was, even before he knew who I truly am. That says something worthwhile about him. Damien crossed the room and took the seat opposite, the same seat his grandfather had once occupied during long evenings of quiet conversation with the very same old man decades earlier, when the Blackthorn Library had first been built as a place for careful, unhurried thinking. And what does it say about her? Alaric finally looked up, setting his book aside. It says she has decided, somewhere in her mind, that a person's worth can be measured by what they can offer her in return. To Elena, I am simply an old man in a plain coat who carries no title, no fortune, and no influence she can see with her eyes. And so, in her mind, I am worth nothing at all. He paused, folding his hands together thoughtfully. It is a dangerous way to measure people, Damien, especially in a world such as ours, where the ones who appear to hold no power are often the very ones who hold the most. You're not angry, Damien observed. Why would I be angry? Alaric said, a faint, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. I asked to be tested along with her. In a manner of speaking, I wanted to see exactly who she becomes when she believes no one of consequence is watching. Anger would only cloud my judgment, the same as it would cloud yours. I prefer to simply observe, and to let her continue showing me precisely who she is, one small choice at a time. Damien was quiet for a moment, turning the events of the day over carefully in his mind. My father asked me the same question he always asks, whether I believe character reveals itself most clearly in how someone treats those who can offer them nothing. And what do you believe? I believe I'm watching proof of it happen in front of me every single day since she arrived at this manor. Alaric nodded slowly, a flicker of something almost sorrowful passing behind his eyes, quickly replaced by his usual calm patience. Then let us continue watching, together. I will not interfere, and I will not reveal myself before the appropriate moment arrives. But I will tell you this, Damien Cross. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something more serious, more weighted with the authority that decades of quiet influence had earned him. When that moment does arrive, and I suspect it will arrive sooner than either of us expects, there will be no undoing what she has shown me. I have sat on the Continental Council long enough to know that character revealed through small cruelties is rarely a mistake made once. It is a pattern, and patterns do not break themselves. They must be confronted, or they simply repeat, growing bolder each time no consequence follows. Damien held his gaze steadily. I understand. Do you? Alaric asked, something almost gentle in the question now. Because I sense there is more behind your patience than simple curiosity about her character. I sense a young man who already suspects, deep down, that this marriage was built on a foundation that cannot hold. And I sense a young man who is searching, whether he admits it to himself or not, for the proof that will finally allow him to walk away from an arrangement he agreed to long before he understood what true partnership requires. Damien did not answer immediately. Outside the library windows, the last light of evening was fading behind the distant hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet that neither man paid any attention to. My father built this alliance believing power should be measured in territory and wealth, Damien finally said. I want to measure it differently. I want a partner who understands that the pack does not belong to us. We belong to it. Every wolf under my protection, from the highest-ranking elder to the newest pup born last spring, deserves someone who leads with respect, not someone who only performs respect when cameras or crowds are watching. And you do not believe Elena understands this? I don't know yet, Damien admitted. That's exactly why you're here. Alaric smiled then, a genuine smile this time, warm despite the seriousness of the conversation surrounding it. Then we are in agreement, young Cross. Let us continue watching, patiently and carefully, until the answer becomes impossible to deny. He picked his book back up, signaling the conversation's natural end, though one final thought seemed to linger behind his eyes as Damien rose to leave. But be prepared, Alaric added quietly, almost to himself. Whatever this marriage ultimately reveals, the pack, the council, and every family watching from the shadows will remember exactly how it unfolds. Choose your patience carefully, Damien. It may be the very thing that saves you, or the very thing that costs you more than you are prepared to lose. Damien paused at the door, considering the weight of those words before finally nodding once and stepping out into the quiet corridor beyond. Behind him, Alaric returned his attention to the fading light outside the window, his expression calm, patient, and utterly unreadable, exactly as it had been from the very first moment Elena had dismissed him as nothing more than an old man in her way. Meanwhile, in a private study on the opposite side of the manor, Victor Voss sat across from his daughter, a glass of aged whiskey in his hand and a satisfied gleam in his eyes that rarely appeared unless business was going exactly as planned. The Trade Council reached out again this morning, Victor said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Once the wedding is finalized, they want to discuss expanding our shipping routes through cross-territory. Do you understand what that means, Elena? Access we've wanted for 15 years, simply handed to us because of the name you're about to carry. I understand it perfectly, Elena said, seated in the leather chair across from him, legs crossed, a glass of wine untouched at her side. I've understood it since the day you first mentioned this arrangement. Good. Victor leaned forward, his expression turning serious in the particular way it always did when discussing matters he considered truly important. Then you also understand that nothing, and no one, should be allowed to threaten this. Not your temper, not your pride, nothing. This marriage is the single greatest achievement our family has ever secured. Elena's jaw tightened slightly at the implication buried within her father's words, though she kept her expression composed. Do you think I don't know how to manage a household, father? I've handled every detail of this wedding myself. Everything is exactly as it should be. I'm not questioning your management, Victor said, softening only slightly. I'm reminding you of what's at stake. Damien Cross is not simply marrying you for love, Elena, and you are not simply marrying him for the same reason either. Let's not pretend otherwise between the two of us. This is business, dressed in white silk and orchids. Play your part well, and our family's influence will stretch further than either of us ever imagined. Play it poorly. He paused, taking a slow sip of his whiskey, and we lose everything we've spent years building. I don't intend to play it poorly, Elena said, a note of sharp confidence returning to her voice. I intend to be exactly the kind of alpha's wife this pack has never seen before. Powerful, respected, unshakable. Victor smiled, satisfied, clearly hearing only the words that reassured him, and none of the underlying hunger that colored every syllable his daughter spoke. That's my girl, he said. Just remember, appearances matter more in this world than almost anything else. The pack elders, the council members, even the smallest household staff, they all watch everything, every gesture, every word, every moment of impatience. Wolves have long memories, Elena, and even longer tongues when it comes to gossip that reaches the right ears. Elena waved a dismissive hand, the same gesture she had used earlier that day toward Alaric in the hallway. I know how to behave in front of people who matter, father. You don't need to worry about that. Neither of them noticed, nor would they have cared even if they had, that the phrase people who matter carried within it the very flaw Damien and Alaric had already begun to see clearly forming, one careless moment at a time. To Elena, there existed a clear and simple line dividing the world into two categories, those whose opinions could affect her future, and those who could not. She had not yet realized that in a household built on centuries of pack tradition, that line was far blurrier and far more dangerous to misjudge than she currently understood. The wedding was still weeks away. There would be many more moments to watch before the truth finally revealed itself in full. The pre-wedding gathering was meant to be a quiet affair, a small evening of drinks and conversation among close family, and a handful of trusted allies before the larger celebration overtook the manor entirely. Instead, it became the moment several people in that room would remember for years to come, though none would remember it quite the way Elena did. The terrace overlooking the eastern gardens had been strung with soft lanterns, and low music drifted from hidden speakers as guests mingled beneath the evening sky. Damien stood near the stone railing with Nathan, half listening to a conversation about border patrol schedules, his attention drifting more than once toward Elena, who moved through the small crowd with practiced charm, laughing at the right moments, complimenting the right people, playing her part exactly as her father had instructed. Grace Bennett arrived later than most, slipping quietly onto the terrace in a simple dark green dress that stood out among the more elaborate gowns worn by the other women present. She was Alaric's granddaughter, though almost no one at the gathering knew that detail either, since she had been introduced simply as a family friend visiting from the Northern Territories. She found a quiet spot near the edge of the terrace, close enough to observe the gathering without drawing attention to herself, a habit she had clearly inherited from her grandfather. It was there, near the drink table, that the evening took its sharpest turn. Alaric had been standing quietly near the edge of the terrace, dressed once again in his simple gray coat, when Elena approached with two of her cousins trailing behind her, wine glasses in hand and laughter already loosening their voices. "Oh, look who it is," Elena said, her tone carrying just enough volume to draw a few curious glances from nearby guests. "Still wearing that same old coat, I see." One of her cousins giggled behind her hand. Alaric said nothing, simply offering the same calm, patient nod he had given her twice before. "You know," Elena continued, clearly emboldened by the attention gathering around her, "someone really should take you shopping before the wedding. I understand not everyone can afford better, but honestly, it's a bit embarrassing having someone dressed like a groundskeeper wandering around an event this important." She turned slightly toward her cousins, inviting them into the joke. I keep telling the staff to be more careful about who gets invited, but apparently manners aren't a requirement anymore. The nearby guests who had overheard shifted uncomfortably, a few exchanging quick, uncertain glances, unsure whether to laugh along or simply pretend they hadn't heard anything at all. Nathan's hand tightened around his glass, his eyes flicking immediately toward Damien, waiting for some signal, some sign of what to do. Damien did not move. His expression remained perfectly composed, though something in his eyes had sharpened, grown colder, more focused, like a hunter watching prey wander closer to a trap it did not yet know existed. Alaric, for his part, simply smiled, unbothered, and reached calmly for a glass of water from the table beside him. "I've always found comfort more valuable than appearance," he said mildly, his voice carrying no trace of offense, "but I appreciate the concern." Elena laughed, clearly satisfied with what she believed was a clever exchange, and turned away to rejoin the larger crowd, her cousins following close behind, already whispering and giggling about the old groundskeeper, who apparently didn't know how to dress for important occasions. Grace, watching quietly from her spot near the terrace's edge, felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had grown up hearing stories about her grandfather's quiet influence, the respect he commanded from pack elders across dozens of territories, the wars he had prevented simply by speaking calmly at the right moment to the right people. Watching him stand there, dismissed and mocked by a young woman who had no idea who she was truly speaking to, filled her with an urge to step forward, to say something, to correct the imbalance in the room immediately. She didn't. Her grandfather had asked for patience, and patience was something Grace had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to trust in him completely. Instead, she made her way quietly toward Nathan, who stood only a few feet away, still visibly tense from what he had just witnessed. "That woman has no idea what she's doing, does she?" Grace said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only Nathan could hear. Nathan glanced at her, momentarily surprised by the directness of the comment from someone he had barely met. "No," he admitted, "she really doesn't." "Someone should tell her," Grace said, though there was no real conviction behind the suggestion, more an observation of frustration than an actual proposal. "Damien wants her to keep going," Nathan said quietly, glancing toward his friend, who remained near the stone railing, watching the entire scene unfold with the same unreadable calm he always carried, during moments that truly mattered. "He wants to see exactly how far this goes before he decides what to do about it." Grace studied Damien for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, a flicker of quiet respect replacing her earlier frustration. "He's testing her," she said, more to herself than to Nathan. "He's been testing her since the engagement dinner," Nathan confirmed. "And so far, she keeps failing without even realizing there's an exam happening at all." Grace allowed herself a small, private smile, the first genuine one she had shown since arriving at the gathering. "My grandfather always said the most dangerous people in any room are rarely the ones who look powerful. They're the ones who look like they have nothing to lose and everything to prove." Nathan glanced at her again, curiosity flickering behind his eyes now. "You know him well then, the old man in the gray coat?" Grace's smile widened just slightly, though she offered no further explanation, choosing instead to simply say, "Better than most people in this manor will ever realize." Across the terrace, the evening continued much as it had begun, laughter and quiet conversation drifting beneath the strings of soft lantern light, while beneath the surface, the tension Damien had been carefully cultivating for weeks continued to build, brick by brick, exactly as he had told his father it would. Later that night, once most of the guests had departed and only a handful of close family remained, scattered throughout the manor's quieter rooms, Damien found himself once again in the private library, this time joined not only by Alaric but by Grace as well, who had been invited discreetly by her grandfather to observe the household more closely in the weeks leading up to the wedding. "You handled tonight with remarkable patience," Damien said, settling into his usual chair across from the two of them. "I've endured far worse insults from far more dangerous people," Alaric said simply, waving off the concern with the same calm dismissal he had shown Elena on the terrace. "A young woman's careless words about my choice of coat are hardly the greatest offense I've faced in my lifetime." "Still," Damien said, "I saw how uncomfortable it made some of the guests." "Good," Alaric said, a faint smile touching his weathered features. "Discomfort has a way of loosening tongues later, when people believe no one important is listening. You'd be surprised how much useful information travels through a household in the days following an uncomfortable moment like tonight's." Grace, seated quietly near the window, finally spoke, Nathan told me you're waiting for her biggest mistake, she said, studying Damien carefully. What happens once she makes it? Damien considered the question for a long moment before answering. Then everyone in this manor, and everyone on the council, will finally see clearly what I've been seeing for weeks, and there will be no denying it, no smoothing it over, no convincing anyone it was simply a misunderstanding. And until then, Grace asked. Until then, Damien said quietly, we continue watching, patiently, carefully, and we let her show us exactly who she truly is, one careless moment at a time, until the pattern becomes impossible for anyone, including her own father, to ignore. Alaric nodded slowly in agreement, his gaze drifting toward the darkened window, where the last of the lantern lights from the terrace still flickered faintly in the distance. The wedding is close now, he said quietly, almost to himself. Whatever this young woman truly is, it will reveal itself soon enough. These things always do in the end. Patience, young Cross, is simply the art of waiting for a truth that has already decided to reveal itself. We need only remain still long enough to witness it clearly, without flinching away from what we see. The room fell into a comfortable silence after that, three people bound together by a shared understanding that something significant was building beneath the surface of the upcoming wedding, something none of the other guests, least of all Elena herself, had any idea was quietly unfolding around them. What none of the three of them discussed that night, though all three were quietly aware of it, was how quickly word of the terrace incident had already begun spreading through the manor's staff quarters. Servants who had overheard Elena's comment about the groundskeeper repeated the story to one another over late suppers in the kitchen, embellishing small details here and there, until by morning the tale had reached nearly every corner of the household. Among the older staff, many of whom had served the Cross family for decades and understood far more about pack hierarchy than their positions might suggest, the story was met with quiet, uneasy murmurs rather than laughter. She insulted him twice now. An elderly housekeeper named Margaret whispered to one of the younger maids as they folded linens in the laundry room the following morning. Once at the engagement dinner, and now again at the terrace gathering, doesn't she wonder why an old man keeps getting invited to every important event in this house? The younger maid shrugged, clearly unaware of the deeper implications behind Margaret's concern. Maybe he's just a distant relative. The Cross family has dozens of them scattered across the territories. Margaret said nothing further, though the tightness in her expression suggested she suspected something the younger maid did not yet understand. She had worked in this household long enough to recognize the particular quality of respect the elder wolves among the staff extended toward Alaric whenever he passed through the halls, a subtle deference that had nothing to do with his simple clothing or quiet demeanor. Whoever he truly was, Margaret was quite certain he was not simply a distant relative attending a family wedding out of courtesy. By midweek, whispers of the terrace incident had even reached Owen Pierce, a senior member of the regional pack council who had arrived early for the wedding, to finalize several administrative matters with Reginald Cross. Owen was a stern, methodical wolf, known throughout the territories for his sharp attention to detail and his deep, almost reverent respect for the older traditions of pack governance. He mentioned the rumor to Reginald over a quiet breakfast, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes carried an unmistakable weight of concern. "There's talk among the staff," Owen said, stirring his tea slowly, about the young bride's treatment of an elderly guest during the recent gathering. Something about insults regarding his clothing, in front of a fairly large crowd. Reginald's expression remained carefully composed, though he set down his cup with deliberate slowness. "Rumors travel quickly in households full of young staff with too much time on their hands," he said mildly. "I wouldn't put too much weight behind kitchen gossip, Owen." "Perhaps not," Owen said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Still, I've learned over the years that where there's smoke among the staff, there's often a fire worth investigating quietly, before the wedding proceeds any further. The council takes character seriously when confirming new leadership within a pack this size, Reginald. You know this as well as I do." "I do," Reginald agreed carefully. "Rest assured, the matter is already being observed closely by those best positioned to judge it fairly." Owen studied his old friend for a long moment, sensing there was more behind the careful phrasing than Reginald intended to reveal just yet. "I trust your judgment, as I always have," he said finally, "but I would encourage you not to wait too long before addressing whatever you've already discovered. Weddings have a way of moving forward with unstoppable momentum once the invitations have been sent and the arrangements finalized. It becomes far harder to correct a mistake once the entire council has already gathered to witness the ceremony." Reginald nodded slowly, understanding the warning embedded within his old friend's words far better than Owen likely realized. "The right moment will present itself," he said simply. "These things always do, in time." Owen said nothing further, though though he made a quiet note, both mentally and in the small leather journal he carried everywhere, to watch the young bride's behavior closely during the remaining days leading up to the ceremony. He was not a wolf who believed in leaving matters of character to chance, especially when the stability of an entire pack empire hung in the balance. Elena, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware that her careless words on the terrace had already begun traveling far beyond the small crowd who had witnessed them directly, spreading quietly through staff quarters, breakfast conversations, and the private notes of senior council members, each retelling adding another small crack to a foundation she still believed was solid and unshakable. Outside, the lanterns on the terrace flickered one final time before going dark, and the manor settled slowly into the quiet stillness of night, carrying within its walls a secret that would not remain hidden for very much longer. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a clear sky, the kind of bright, cloudless day that photographers dream about and superstitious elders consider a favorable sign for a long and prosperous union. Blackthorn Manor had been transformed overnight into something out of a storybook, white flowers cascading down every archway, silver ribbons wrapped around the ancient stone pillars lining the main courtyard, and rows of polished chairs arranged in perfect symmetry facing a raised platform draped in soft ivory fabric. Elena stood in the bridal suite, surrounded by attendants fussing over the final details of her gown, a stunning creation of white silk and delicate lace that had taken 3 months and countless fittings to perfect. She studied her reflection in the tall mirror with quiet satisfaction, turning slightly to admire the way the fabric caught the morning light. "You look radiant," Charlotte said from behind her, adjusting the final pin in Elena's elaborate hairstyle. "Everyone downstairs is already talking about how perfect everything looks." "It should be perfect," Elena replied, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. "I've spent months making sure of it." Charlotte hesitated, glancing at her friend's reflection in the mirror. "Are you nervous?" Elena considered the question for a moment, her confident expression flickering only slightly. "Nervous isn't the right word," she said finally. "I've waited my entire life for a moment like this. Today, everyone in this territory finally understands exactly who I am." Down in the courtyard, Damien stood near the platform in a tailored dark suit, Nathan beside him serving as his second in the ceremony, exactly as tradition required. The guests had begun arriving in steady waves, filling the rows of polished chairs with representatives from nearly every noble pack family across the eastern and northern territories. Reginald Cross sat in the front row beside several senior council members, including Owen Pierce, whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the concerns he had voiced privately just days earlier. Near the back of the gathering, quiet and unassuming as always, Alaric took his seat beside Grace, both of them dressed simply compared to the elaborate finery surrounding them, both of them watching the proceedings with the same patient attentiveness they had carried throughout the preceding weeks. Simon Blake, alpha of the neighboring Ashwood pack and a long-standing rival of the Cross family's regional influence, made his way toward Damien shortly before the ceremony began, his expression carrying the polite smile of someone who rarely offered genuine warmth without an underlying motive. "A beautiful day for a union of this magnitude," Simon said, extending a hand that Damien accepted out of necessity rather than genuine friendliness. "The Voss family's trade influence combined with your territory's resources. Quite the strategic achievement, wouldn't you agree?" "It's a wedding, Simon," Damien replied evenly, "not a business merger." Simon's smile widened slightly, unconvinced. Of course. Though I imagine the council will be watching closely to see how this new alliance strengthens your position moving forward. Some of us have wondered for years whether the Cross family's dominance in this region would ever face genuine competition." He glanced briefly toward the gathered crowd, lowering his voice slightly. "Tell me, has your bride proven herself worthy of the responsibility she's about to inherit? I've heard whispers here and there about certain incidents during the preparation weeks." Damien's expression remained perfectly composed, though something sharpened behind his eyes at the thinly veiled probe. "Rumors tend to exaggerate themselves the further they travel, Simon. I wouldn't put too much stock in kitchen gossip." "No, I suppose not," Simon said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Still, character matters a great deal in matters of pack leadership, wouldn't you agree? The council takes these things quite seriously when confirming succession. I'd hate to see any complications arise from an otherwise promising union." Nathan, standing nearby, bristled slightly at the implication buried within Simon's words but said nothing, waiting instead for Damien's response. "There won't be any complications," Damien said simply, his tone carrying a quiet certainty that left little room for further discussion. "Whatever needs to be addressed will be addressed properly, and at the appropriate time." Simon studied him a moment longer. clearly searching for some crack in Damien's composed exterior, before finally offering a small nod and retreating toward his assigned seat among the other visiting pack leaders. Nathan exhaled slowly once he had gone. "He's fishing for weakness," Nathan muttered. "He always is," Damien replied. "Simon Blake has spent a decade waiting for any excuse to challenge our territory's influence. He won't find one today." "And after today?" Nathan asked quietly. Damien's gaze drifted toward the manor's upper windows, where Elena would soon emerge to begin her walk down the flower-lined aisle. "After today, we'll see exactly what there is to find." The ceremony began precisely on schedule, the officiant taking his place at the center of the platform as the string quartet shifted into a slow, elegant melody signaling the bride's approach. Every head in the courtyard turned as Elena appeared at the top of the manor's grand staircase, her white gown catching the sunlight beautifully as she began her measured descent toward the aisle. She looked, by every outward measure, exactly like the picture of a perfect bride, poised and radiant, her expression carrying just the right mixture of joy and solemnity expected of the occasion. The guests murmured their approval as she passed, several reaching out to touch the edge of her gown or offer quiet words of congratulation. Damien watched her approach with careful attention, searching, as he had throughout every moment of the preceding weeks, for some sign of the true character hidden beneath the polished performance. He found none in her expression today, only the practiced calm of someone keenly aware that every eye in the courtyard was fixed upon her. The vows exchanged between them were traditional, formal, the same words spoken by generations of cross-family alphas before him, promises of loyalty, protection, and shared leadership over the territories and the wolves who called them home. Elena recited her portion with clear, confident diction, her voice carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. "I vow to stand beside you, to honor this pack's traditions, and to lead alongside you with wisdom, strength, and respect for all who call this territory home," she said, her eyes meeting Damien's with what appeared, to every observer, to be genuine sincerity. Damien recited his own vows in return, his voice steady, though his thoughts remained carefully guarded behind his calm exterior. As the officiant pronounced them formally bound, and the courtyard erupted into applause, Damien felt none of the celebratory relief that filled the faces of the guests surrounding him. Instead, he felt only the quiet continuation of a countdown that had begun weeks earlier, one that had not yet reached its conclusion. Near the back of the gathering, Alaric watched the exchange of vows with careful, unreadable attention, his expression giving away nothing of his private thoughts. Beside him, Grace leaned slightly closer, her voice barely a whisper beneath the sound of applause surrounding them. "Do you believe she meant those words?" she asked quietly. Alaric considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Words spoken during a ceremony reveal very little about a person's true character," he said. "It is the words spoken afterward, in quiet moments when no audience remains to witness them, that reveal everything worth knowing." The reception that followed stretched long into the afternoon, filled with toasts, dancing, and the kind of extravagant celebration befitting the union of two powerful families. Elena moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations, posing for photographs, playing her role exactly as she had rehearsed it for months. To every outside observer, the day appeared to be an unqualified success, the perfect beginning to a promising new chapter for the cross-family empire. But as the sun began setting behind the distant hills, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, Owen Pierce found a quiet moment to approach Reginald once more, his expression carrying the same careful weight it had during their breakfast conversation days earlier. "A beautiful ceremony," Owen said quietly, watching the newly married couple share their first dance beneath strings of soft lantern light. "Let us hope the marriage proves as beautiful as the wedding itself." Reginald said nothing in response, his eyes fixed on his son and new daughter-in-law as they moved gracefully across the dance floor, his expression carrying a quiet, patient watchfulness that mirrored the very same look Damien had worn throughout the entire ceremony. During their first dance, with the entire courtyard watching and the string quartet playing a slow, sweeping melody, Elena leaned close to Damien's ear, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "Did you see how many council members came today?" she whispered, a note of quiet triumph coloring her words. "Even families from the northern territories made the trip. This is exactly the kind of attention I wanted." "It's a large gathering," Damien agreed carefully, guiding her through the next turn of the dance with practiced ease. "It's more than large," Elena said, pulling back slightly to meet his eyes, her expression bright with satisfaction. "It's proof. Proof that I made the right choice agreeing to this marriage. and proof that everyone here already understands how much influence we're going to hold together." She smiled, though something calculating lingered behind the warmth of it. "I overheard two of the visiting alphas discussing whether our territory might expand its trade routes even further once the council formally recognizes the union. Can you imagine it, Damien? We could control nearly a third of the eastern corridor within a few years." Damien studied her carefully as she spoke, searching, as he always did, for some deeper understanding behind her words, some acknowledgement of the responsibility that came with the influence she seemed so eager to claim. He found only excitement at the prospect of expanded power, with little mention of the wolves who lived within the territories she spoke of so casually. "Expansion isn't simply about influence," Damien said carefully. "Every territory we're responsible for is filled with families who depend on fair leadership. Growth matters less than how well we care for what we already hold." Elena's smile faltered only slightly before recovering. "Of course," she said quickly. "That's exactly what I meant. Fair leadership, growth, all of it together." She squeezed his hand lightly as the dance continued, though Damien noted, quietly and without comment, how effortlessly she had shifted her words to match what she sensed he wanted to hear, rather than what she had actually been thinking only moments before. The dance ended, and the celebration continued late into the evening, guests scattering across the courtyard in small clusters of conversation, laughter drifting from every corner of the manor grounds. Damien excused himself briefly near midnight, finding a quiet moment alone near the stone fountain at the courtyard's edge, away from the noise and the watching eyes that had followed his every movement throughout the entire day. Nathan found him there several minutes later, 2 glasses of water in hand, offering one to his friend as he settled onto the low stone wall beside him. "Long day," Nathan said simply. "Long weeks," Damien corrected quietly. "You didn't answer Simon Blake earlier," Nathan observed, "about whether she's proven herself worthy yet." Damien turned the glass slowly in his hands, watching the reflection of scattered lantern light ripple across the fountain's dark water. "Because the answer isn't finished revealing itself yet," he said. "Today she performed exactly as expected, in front of exactly the right audience. The wedding was never going to show me anything new. Weddings are performances, Nathan. Everyone knows how to smile and speak kindly when the entire world is watching. Then what are you waiting for?" "The moments after," Damien said quietly. "The private conversations, the unguarded instructions given to staff who believe no one important is listening. The small decisions made when she thinks the only consequence is convenience, not character." He glanced toward the manor's upper windows, where Elena's laughter could still be heard drifting down from a gathering of her cousins celebrating late into the night. "That's where the truth lives, Nathan. Not here, beneath the lanterns and the music. Somewhere quieter, when she believes no one worth impressing remains to see it." Nathan considered his friend's words for a long moment before nodding slowly. "And if that truth turns out to be exactly what you already suspect?" Damien's expression remained calm, though something steady and certain settled behind his eyes. "Then I will already know precisely what needs to happen next." The wedding, everyone agreed, had been perfect. But perfection, as Damien understood far better than most of the celebrating guests around him, was often nothing more than a carefully maintained performance, waiting patiently for the moment when the performance finally slipped, and the truth beneath it revealed itself for everyone to see. 2 weeks after the wedding, a message arrived at Blackthorn Manor that sent a quiet ripple of anticipation through every senior council member who received a copy. The Continental Pack Council announced it would be reconvening for its annual formal summit earlier than usual this year, citing an unspecified matter of significant regional importance requiring the full council's attention. Attached to the announcement was a single line that caught the attention of every experienced political mind who read it. A founding elder of the council, long retired from public affairs, would be attending in person for the first time in over a decade. Owen Pierce read the announcement twice over his morning coffee, setting the paper down slowly as understanding settled across his weathered features. He had served on the council for nearly 20 years and had heard stories, whispered occasionally among the oldest members, about a founding elder who had stepped back from active politics generations earlier, choosing quiet retirement over continued influence. The stories rarely mentioned a name directly, out of respect for the elder's wishes, but the descriptions were consistent enough that Owen found himself wondering, for the first time, whether the quiet old man he had noticed sitting near the back of Damien's wedding might be connected to the very same figure the rumors described. He mentioned nothing of his suspicion to anyone, choosing instead to watch and wait, exactly as pack tradition had taught him decades earlier. Meanwhile, inside the manor, Elena had settled comfortably into her new role as Damien's wife. And with that comfort came an increasing willingness to involve herself directly in matters of pack administration that had traditionally fallen solely under Damien's authority. She began attending morning briefings with the household stewards, offering opinions on trade schedules and territory disputes despite having no formal experience navigating pack governance. When one of the senior stewards gently suggested that certain decisions required Damien's direct approval before being finalized, Elena waved the concern aside with practiced confidence. "I'm his wife," she said simply, during a meeting held one particularly busy Tuesday morning. "Whatever decisions I make on his behalf carry the same authority as if he made them himself. There's no need to trouble him with every small detail." The steward, an older wolf named Henry Doyle who had served the Cross family faithfully for over 30 years, exchanged a brief, uncertain glance with his colleague, before nodding reluctantly and proceeding with Elena's instructions, despite his private reservations about the wisdom of doing so. Word of Elena's growing involvement in household decisions reached Damien later that same day, delivered carefully by Nathan during a quiet walk through the training yard. "She authorized a shipment reroute without consulting anyone," Nathan said. "Henry mentioned it during our morning meeting. Apparently she believes her authority extends to nearly every decision made under this roof now that the marriage is official." Damien's expression remained calm, though something behind his eyes sharpened with quiet attention. "What was the reroute?" "Nothing catastrophic," Nathan admitted, "but it wasn't her decision to make, and she made it without understanding the full context behind the original arrangement. Henry says it will cost us a delay of nearly a week once the correction is made." Damien nodded slowly, filing the information away alongside everything else he had been quietly collecting over the preceding weeks. It was a small mistake, hardly significant on its own, but it fit neatly into a growing pattern he had begun to notice ever since the wedding concluded. Elena, it seemed, believed her new title carried authority far beyond what tradition or practicality actually granted her, and she showed little inclination toward asking permission or seeking guidance before acting on that belief. That evening, while preparing for the household's usual dinner service, Elena encountered Alaric once more, this time in the manor's private garden, where he often took quiet evening walks along the stone pathways lined with carefully tended roses. "I need the garden cleared before this weekend," Elena announced without preamble, approaching him directly, as though continuing a conversation from earlier, rather than beginning a new one. "We're hosting several council representatives who arrived early for the upcoming summit, and I want the pathways properly maintained before they arrive." Alaric regarded her calmly, his hands folded behind his back in the same unhurried posture he always carried. "The gardeners have already scheduled their work for tomorrow morning," he said mildly. "I imagine everything will be prepared well before the weekend." "I wasn't asking for your opinion on the schedule," Elena said, a flicker of irritation crossing her expression. "I was informing you that the garden needs to be ready. If you have some connection to the household staff, perhaps you could make yourself useful and pass along the message, rather than standing here offering unsolicited assurances." Alaric's expression did not change, though something quiet and patient settled behind his eyes, the same calm certainty he had shown throughout every prior encounter with her. "Of course," he said simply. "I'll make certain the message reaches the appropriate hands." Elena turned and walked away without another word, clearly satisfied that she had handled the exchange exactly as she intended, leaving Alaric standing alone among the roses, watching her retreating figure with quiet, unreadable patience. He mentioned the exchange to Damien later that evening, recounting it with the same calm detachment he brought to every observation he shared during their private conversations in the library. "She still believes I hold no authority worth respecting," Alaric said, settling into his usual chair near the tall windows. "It's a consistent pattern, Damien. Consistent enough that I no longer believe it is simple carelessness on her part. I believe it reflects something deeper about how she views the value of people around her." "You think she genuinely believes some people matter less than others," Damien said, though it was more statement than question. "I think she has organized the entire world into a simple hierarchy in her mind," Alaric replied. "Those with visible wealth, visible titles, visible influence, sit at the top, deserving of her respect and careful attention. Everyone else, regardless of their actual significance, falls somewhere beneath her notice entirely." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "It is a dangerous way to move through a world such as ours, Damien, where true influence rarely announces itself with obvious markers of wealth or status. The wolves who hold the greatest power in our society are often the ones who choose deliberately to appear, as though they hold none at all." Damien absorbed this quietly, turning the observation over in his mind, alongside everything Nathan had told him earlier about the shipment reroute and Elena's growing habit of making unilateral decisions without proper consultation. "The council summit is approaching quickly," he said finally. "Once you're formally recognized there, in front of the full assembly, there will be no more hiding who you truly are." "No," Alaric agreed. "There will not. Are you concerned about how she'll react?" Alaric considered this for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkened garden visible through the tall windows, where the roses he had walked among earlier now sat quiet and still beneath the evening sky. "I am not concerned for myself," he said finally. "I have weathered far greater storms than the discomfort of a young woman realizing she has misjudged someone's importance. I am concerned, however, for what her reaction might reveal about her true character, once the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Some people, upon realizing their mistake, choose humility and genuine reflection. Others choose denial, deflection, or worse, an attempt to charm their way out of consequences they have not actually earned the right to avoid." "And which do you expect from Elena?" Alaric's expression remained carefully neutral, though something quiet and knowing lingered behind his weathered eyes. "I expect," he said slowly, "that we will find out together very soon." Charlotte found Elena the following afternoon in the bridal suite that had since become her private dressing room, sorting through a rack of gowns for the upcoming summit reception. She had heard, through one of the household maids, about the exchange in the garden, and something about the story had unsettled her enough to bring it up directly. "You should be more careful with that old man," Charlotte said, closing the door behind her as she entered. Elena barely glanced up from the gown she was inspecting. "What old man?" "The one in the gray coat. The one you keep dismissing." Charlotte crossed her arms, choosing her words carefully. "Margaret mentioned something to me last week. Something about how the older staff treat him. There's a kind of respect there, Elena, the kind that doesn't usually get extended to random relatives visiting for a wedding." "Margaret gossips about everything," Elena said, waving the concern aside as she held a deep blue gown up against the light. "She probably just feels sorry for him because he's old and doesn't have anywhere better to be." "Maybe," Charlotte said, though doubt lingered in her voice. "But I overheard Owen Pierce mention something too, when he thought no one important was listening. Something about a founding council elder attending the upcoming summit in person for the first time in years. It's probably nothing, but the timing feels a little strange, doesn't it? An unfamiliar old man appearing at every major event since the engagement, right before an announcement like that." Elena finally looked up, a flicker of genuine consideration crossing her features for the first time since the conversation began. For a brief moment, something like caution seemed to surface behind her eyes, but it passed quickly, replaced almost immediately by her familiar, dismissive confidence. "You're overthinking this," she said, setting the blue gown aside in favor of a silver one. "Even if he does turn out to be someone important, what does it matter? I haven't done anything wrong. I've simply given a few instructions to household staff, exactly the way any alpha's wife would. If he's truly some retired council figure, I'm sure he understands how households function. Elderly men who've spent their lives around pack politics don't get offended over a few practical instructions about gardens and table linens." Charlotte studied her friend for a long moment, unconvinced but unwilling to push the point further. "Just be careful," she said again, quieter this time. "That's all I'm asking." "I'm always careful," Elena replied, holding the silver gown up against herself in the mirror, already moving past the conversation entirely. "Now, tell me honestly, does this color wash me out, or does it work with the summit's evening lighting?" Charlotte offered a small, half-hearted opinion about the gown, recognizing that the conversation, as far as Elena was concerned, had already ended. She left the suite a few minutes later, a quiet unease settling in her chest that she couldn't quite explain, the same unease that had been building steadily since the engagement dinner months earlier, growing sharper with every small cruelty she had watched her friend commit without a single moment of genuine reflection afterward. What neither Elena nor Charlotte realized was that their conversation had not gone entirely unheard. Wolves possess hearing far sharper than most creatures walking the earth, and the walls of Blackthorn Manor, however elegant, had never been particularly effective at containing sound from curious ears passing through the corridor outside. Margaret, the elderly housekeeper who had first noticed the staff's quiet deference toward Alaric weeks earlier, happened to be folding linens in the hallway closet directly beside the bridal suite when the conversation took place. She said nothing, continuing her work with practiced discretion, but the exchange confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. Elena, it seemed, had been warned, quite clearly, about the danger she was walking toward, and she had chosen, without a moment's hesitation, to dismiss the warning entirely, far more concerned with the color of a gown than the identity of a man she had insulted no fewer than 3 times since first arriving at the manor. Margaret finished her task quietly and moved on to her next duty, carrying the small piece of knowledge with her, exactly as countless other members of the household staff were beginning to do with similar fragments of information gathered from careless conversations, held within earshot of ears far more attentive than anyone in the family upstairs seemed to realize. Outside, the evening deepened into night, and somewhere across the manor grounds, Elena moved through her final preparations for the approaching council summit, entirely unaware that the quiet old man she had dismissed so casually in the garden was about to step into a role that would reveal, in front of the very audience she most wanted to impress, exactly how deeply she had misjudged the world around her. The days leading up to the council summit brought a steady stream of visiting dignitaries to Blackthorn Manor, senior representatives from pack territories across the continent arriving early to settle into their accommodations before the formal proceedings began. Among them was Laura Whitfield, a respected council member known throughout the territories for her sharp memory and her tendency to notice details others often overlooked entirely. Laura arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, greeted personally by Reginald Cross at the manor's main entrance, and was soon introduced to Elena during a small welcoming gathering held in the main hall. The introduction went smoothly enough on the surface, Elena offering practiced warmth and gracious hospitality, exactly as she had learned to perform for important guests over the preceding months. It was later that same evening, during a private dinner attended by several visiting council members, that the second significant incident occurred, one that would prove far more difficult to dismiss as simple kitchen gossip than the previous ones had been. The dinner had been arranged formally, with assigned seating and careful attention paid to protocol befitting the gathering of such distinguished guests. Elena, seated near the head of the table beside Damien, found herself in an animated conversation with 2 visiting alphas about upcoming trade negotiations when Alaric entered the dining hall, arriving slightly later than the other guests due to a private conversation he had been having with Grace in the adjoining study. "Ah, there's our mysterious wandering guest," Elena said, her voice carrying easily across the table, as Alaric took his usual quiet seat near the far end. Several heads turned at the comment, curiosity flickering across unfamiliar faces who had not yet been introduced to the older man. "I keep telling my husband we should find him a proper role within the household staff, given how often he seems to wander through every important gathering we host." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the visiting dignitaries, though Laura Whitfield's expression remained carefully unreadable, her sharp eyes shifting between Elena and the quiet old man at the far end of the table with growing interest. "Perhaps he simply enjoys good company," one of the visiting alphas offered diplomatically, clearly trying to smooth over the awkwardness of the moment. "Perhaps," Elena said, laughing lightly, "though I do wonder sometimes whether we should be more selective about who receives invitations to events of this importance. It seems only fair to the families who worked hard to earn their seats at gatherings like this." Damien's jaw tightened beneath the table, though his expression remained carefully composed for the benefit of the watching guests. Beside him, Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking briefly toward Reginald, who sat further down the table wearing an expression of practiced neutrality that revealed nothing of the concern building steadily behind his calm exterior. Alaric, for his part, simply continued eating his meal with quiet composure, offering no visible reaction to Elena's comment, though Grace, seated beside him, felt her hands tighten briefly around her fork before she carefully relaxed them again, remembering her grandfather's insistence on patience above all else. Laura Whitfield, however, had noticed something the other guests had missed entirely. She had traveled extensively throughout the territories during her decades on the council, attending countless gatherings and formal events across dozens of pack families, and something about the old man's calm, unbothered demeanor in the face of such casual disrespect struck her as deeply familiar, though she couldn't yet place exactly why. After dinner concluded and the guests began dispersing into smaller groups for evening conversation, Laura found a quiet moment to approach Owen Pierce, who stood near the hall's grand fireplace nursing a glass of wine. "That elderly gentleman," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only Owen could hear. "The one the young bride keeps making comments about. Something about him seems familiar to me, though I can't quite place it." Owen's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition passing behind his eyes. "You noticed it too then?" "Noticed what exactly?" "I'm not entirely certain yet," Owen admitted carefully, "but I've been watching him since the wedding, and there's something in the way the older household staff treat him. A kind of deference that doesn't match someone simply attending as a distant family friend." He glanced across the hall toward where Alaric now sat quietly beside Grace near one of the tall windows, both of them engaged in a soft, private conversation, away from the rest of the gathering. I've heard old stories, whispered among the longest-serving council members, about a founding elder who withdrew from public life generations ago. The descriptions never included a name, out of respect for his wishes, but certain details always seemed consistent. Laura's eyes widened slightly as understanding began to settle over her features. You believe that man is? I believe nothing yet, Owen said quickly, cutting her off with a subtle shake of his head. Suspicion is not confirmation, Laura, but I would encourage you to watch closely during the remaining days before the summit begins. If my suspicion proves correct, this young bride has been making a very serious mistake, over and over again, in front of exactly the wrong audience. Laura absorbed this information carefully, her sharp mind already beginning to reconsider every interaction she had witnessed since arriving at the manor just hours earlier. And the young alpha heir, Damien Cross, does he know? Owen's expression grew thoughtful. I believe, he said slowly, that Damien Cross has known far more than he's revealed to anyone since long before this wedding ever took place. Across the hall, unaware of the quiet conversation unfolding near the fireplace, Elena continued mingling with her guests, laughing easily, accepting compliments about the evening's arrangements, entirely satisfied with how the dinner had proceeded. She had not noticed Laura Whitfield's careful, calculating glances toward the quiet old man near the window, nor had she registered the subtle tension that had settled over Reginald Cross's expression the moment her comment about staff invitations had left her lips. Later that night, once the guests had retired to their assigned quarters and the manor had settled into quiet stillness, Grace found her way to the private library where she knew, without needing to ask, that her grandfather would likely be waiting. Laura Whitfield suspects something, Grace said, closing the door behind her. I saw the way she was watching you during dinner. I noticed as well, Alaric said calmly, setting aside the book he had been reading. Laura has always possessed a sharper mind than most of her colleagues on the council. It was only a matter of time before someone began piecing together the truth. Does it concern you? Grace asked. Being recognized before the summit itself? No, Alaric said, a faint smile touching his weathered features. If anything, it simplifies matters considerably. Suspicion has a way of traveling quickly among those who understand its implications. By the time the summit formally begins, I suspect several council members will already understand exactly who they are looking at, even if my identity remains officially unconfirmed until that moment arrives. Grace settled into the chair across from him, studying her grandfather carefully. And Elena, do you think she suspects anything at all? Alaric considered the question thoughtfully before answering. I think, he said slowly, that Elena Voss has spent her entire life believing that influence always announces itself clearly. Through wealth, through title, through outward displays of status, she has been trained since childhood to recognize instantly. She has not yet learned that true influence often prefers silence, and that the wolves who hold the greatest power in our world are frequently the very ones who choose never to announce it at all. He paused, his expression growing quieter, more contemplative. She will learn this lesson very soon, Grace. I only hope, for her own sake, that she learns it with enough humility remaining to salvage something worthwhile from the experience. Grace said nothing further, though something in her grandfather's tone suggested he already suspected, quite clearly, exactly how little hope remained for that particular outcome. The following morning brought a fresh complication, one that Nathan delivered to Damien with visible frustration, as they walked together through the training yard before sunrise, a habit the two of them had maintained since their youth. She overruled Henry again, Nathan said, his voice tight with barely restrained irritation. This time it wasn't a minor shipment. She authorized new terms for the Northern Border Patrol rotation, without consulting you, or the border captains, or anyone with actual knowledge of the territory's current tensions with the Ashwood Pack. Damien stopped walking, turning to face his friend fully. What terms? She reduced the number of patrol wolves stationed along the northern boundary, claiming it would free up resources for the summit's hospitality arrangements, Nathan said. Henry tried to explain that Simon Blake's territory has been testing that boundary for months, but she told him the decision was final, and that questioning her authority in front of household staff was, in her words, undermining the household's leadership structure. Damien felt something cold settle in his chest, a feeling entirely separate from the patient calculation he had maintained throughout the preceding weeks. This was no longer simply a matter of wounded pride or careless words directed at an old man in a gray coat. This was a decision that placed actual wolves in actual danger, made by someone with no understanding of the delicate balance required to manage a contested border. Reverse it, Damien said immediately. Restore the original patrol numbers before the day is finished. Already done, Nathan said. I spoke with Henry myself an hour ago, but Damien, this is the third time in 2 weeks she's made a decision like this. Small choices that seem reasonable to her, made without any real understanding of the consequences they carry. Sooner or later, one of these decisions is going to cause damage that can't be quietly corrected before anyone notices. Damien remained silent for a long moment, staring out across the training yard where a handful of young wolves were already beginning their morning drills, unaware of the conversation taking place near the yard's edge. I know, he said finally. I've been watching this pattern build since the day of the engagement dinner. It's no longer just about how she treats Alaric. It's about how she understands power itself. She believes her title grants her authority over decisions she has neither the experience nor the patience to make wisely. So what happens now? Nathan asked. The summit is only days away. If she keeps making decisions like this, keeps insulting a founding council elder in front of visiting dignitaries, keeps believing her marriage certificate is a substitute for actual leadership, something is going to break, Damien. And it might break in front of the entire council, at the worst possible moment. Damien's expression grew resolute, the quiet patience he had carried for weeks finally beginning to sharpen into something closer to readiness. Then let it break there, he said. In front of the council is exactly where it needs to happen, Nathan. Not quietly, not privately, where her father's influence and her own considerable charm might convince people to overlook the pattern. It needs to happen where every senior member of this pack's governing body can witness it clearly, without any room left for doubt or excuse. Nathan studied his friend carefully, understanding settling slowly across his features. You've been waiting for this all along, he said. Not just watching, waiting for exactly this moment. I've been hoping I was wrong, Damien corrected quietly. Hoping that somewhere along the way, she would show me something different than what I keep witnessing. But hope isn't a strategy, Nathan, and I can't build the future of this entire territory around the possibility that she might eventually change on her own. He turned back toward the manor, his expression settling into the same calm, patient certainty that had carried him through every difficult decision since childhood. The summit will show everyone exactly who she is, and when it does, I intend to be ready. Later that afternoon, Grace found Nathan near the stables, checking on one of the border patrol horses that had returned lame from the previous night's reduced rotation. She had heard, through Alaric, about the tension building steadily throughout the household, and something about Nathan's evident frustration drew her toward a conversation she hadn't quite planned to have. He's not going to wait much longer, is he? Grace said, watching Nathan carefully tend to the horse's injured leg. No, Nathan admitted, I don't think he is. Good, Grace said, surprising him with the firmness in her voice. My grandfather has spent his entire life practicing patience most people could never sustain for even a single afternoon. But even he has limits, Nathan, and I think we're getting close to discovering exactly where his limits truly lie. Nathan glanced up at her, something like quiet respect passing between them. You care about him a great deal, he observed. Your grandfather, I mean. He raised me after my parents died in a territory dispute when I was young, Grace said simply. Everything I understand about strength, about patience, about true leadership, I learned from watching him navigate decades of pack politics without ever once raising his voice, or resorting to cruelty, even toward people who deeply deserved it. She paused, watching the injured horse shift its weight carefully, watching someone treat him the way Elena has, over and over, without a single moment of self-awareness. It's difficult to witness. I understand why Damien has been so patient, but I also understand why that patience is beginning to wear thin. Nathan nodded slowly, finishing his examination of the horse's leg before straightening to face her fully. The summit will settle it, he said, one way or another. Yes, Grace agreed quietly. I believe it will. The council summit was now only days away, and throughout the manor, the quiet threads of suspicion, gossip, and careful observation continued weaving themselves together into a pattern that would soon become impossible for anyone, including Elena herself, to ignore any longer. The Continental Pack Council convened on a cool autumn morning inside the Grand Assembly Hall, a towering stone structure built centuries earlier specifically for gatherings of this magnitude. Its high vaulted ceilings and ancient carved pillars designed to hold the weight of decisions capable of shaping entire territories for generations to come. Representatives from every major pack family across the continent filled the tiered seating surrounding the central floor, their formal attire and careful postures reflecting the gravity of the occasion. Elena arrived at Damien's side dressed in an elegant deep burgundy gown, her expression carrying the composed confidence of someone fully prepared to make an unforgettable impression on the assembled dignitaries. She had spent the morning rehearsing polite greetings and thoughtful questions to pose to various council members, determined to establish herself as a capable and respected presence within pack governance from her very first formal appearance. The summit began with routine matters, updates on trade agreements between neighboring territories, discussions regarding resource allocation for the coming winter season, and a brief report on recent border tensions along the northern boundary that Damien listened to with particular attention, given the reduced patrol numbers Elena had authorized just days earlier. Owen Pierce delivered this portion of the proceedings with careful neutrality, though his eyes flicked briefly toward Elena as he mentioned the recent adjustment to patrol staffing, noting simply that the matter had since been corrected through appropriate channels. Elena, seated beside Damien in the section reserved for the Cross family and their closest allies, appeared entirely unbothered by the reference, clearly not registering the subtle weight behind Owen's careful phrasing. It was nearly an hour into the proceedings when the summit's presiding chairwoman, an elderly alpha named Constance Ford who had overseen council gatherings for nearly 3 decades, rose from her central seat and called for the assembly's attention. "Before we proceed further," Constance announced, her voice carrying clearly across the vast hall, "the council wishes to formally recognize the presence of a distinguished elder who has graciously agreed to attend this summit in person, an honor this body has not received in over a decade." A murmur of curious anticipation rippled through the gathered representatives. Elena glanced around the hall, mildly curious but not particularly invested in whatever announcement was about to unfold. "Many of you have heard the old stories," Constance continued, whispered among the longest-serving members of this council, regarding one of the founding elders who helped establish the very charter that governs our proceedings to this day. A wolf whose quiet wisdom prevented 3 separate territorial wars during the council's earliest decades, and whose counsel remains woven into nearly every tradition we honor within these walls. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle fully over the hall. "It is my great honor to formally welcome back, after many years of well-earned retirement, Elder Alaric Thorne." The hall fell into stunned silence for a brief moment, before erupting into a wave of astonished murmurs and reverent applause. Alaric rose slowly from his seat, several rows behind where Elena and Damien sat, dressed in the same simple gray coat he had worn to nearly every gathering since the engagement dinner months earlier. He moved toward the central floor with unhurried dignity, acknowledging the applause with a small, humble nod, while council members who had served for decades rose respectfully from their seats, several bowing their heads slightly as he passed. Elena's face drained of color the moment understanding crashed over her, the pieces of the past several months snapping suddenly into place with devastating clarity. The old man in the plain gray coat, the one she had ordered to move crates of table linens, the one she had mocked in front of 200 guests at her own engagement dinner, humiliated again on the terrace before the wedding, and dismissed a 3rd time in the garden just days before this very summit. He was not a distant relative. He was not household staff. He was Alaric Thorne, founding elder of the Continental Pack Council, a figure so respected within pack governance that senior representatives who had served for 30 years rose to their feet the moment his name was spoken aloud. "Oh no," Elena whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them, her hand tightening around the edge of her chair as the full weight of her repeated mistakes settled over her like a physical blow. Damien, seated beside her, kept his expression carefully composed, though he felt no small measure of quiet satisfaction watching the truth finally reveal itself exactly as he had known, eventually, it would. He did not look at Elena directly, choosing instead to keep his attention focused on Alaric as the elder took his place at the center of the hall, addressing the assembled council with the same calm, measured warmth he had shown throughout every private conversation Damien had shared with him over the preceding months. "I thank the council for this generous welcome," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, despite its quiet, unhurried quality. "I have spent many peaceful years away from these proceedings, choosing instead to observe our territories from a distance, watching how the newer generation of leaders navigates the responsibilities passed down to them." His gaze swept slowly across the assembled representatives, pausing, though only briefly, on the section where Elena sat frozen in mortified silence. "I returned today not simply to observe old traditions, but because certain matters have come to my attention recently that I believe warrant this council's careful consideration." A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the hall, curiosity and quiet apprehension mingling in equal measure among the gathered dignitaries. Simon Blake, seated among the visiting alphas, leaned forward with obvious interest, sensing an opportunity forming that he had not anticipated when he arrived that morning. Elena leaned toward Damien, her voice barely a whisper, panic beginning to creep into her tone for the first time since he had known her. "Did you know?" she asked. "Did you know who he was this entire time?" Damien turned to meet her eyes fully for the first time since the announcement, his expression calm, unreadable, carrying none of the reassurance she had clearly hoped to find there. "Yes," he said simply. "I've known since the night of our engagement dinner." Elena's mouth opened slightly, shock and disbelief warring across her features. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to know who you truly were," Damien said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to ensure only she could hear it, "when you believed no one important was watching." The color that had already drained from Elena's face seemed to drain further still, understanding settling over her with crushing weight as she realized, with sudden and terrible clarity, exactly how thoroughly she had been observed, tested, and found wanting throughout every single interaction she believed had gone unnoticed. Across the hall, Alaric continued addressing the council, his tone remaining measured and calm despite the gravity clearly building beneath his words. "Character," he said, his gaze sweeping once more across the assembled representatives, "reveals itself most honestly, not in grand gestures made before watching crowds, but in the countless small choices made when a person believes the consequences of their actions will never truly reach them." He paused, allowing the weight of the observation to settle fully over the silent hall. "I have spent recent months observing exactly such choices, made by someone very close to this gathering, and I believe this council deserves to understand fully what those choices have revealed before we proceed any further with today's formal business." Elena's breathing had grown shallow and quick, her earlier composure entirely shattered. Replaced by a rising tide of panic she struggled desperately to conceal from the watching eyes surrounding her. Beside her, Damien remained perfectly still, watching the moment he had quietly anticipated for months finally begin to unfold exactly as he had known, eventually, that it would. Several rows behind the cross-family section, Owen Pierce leaned toward Laura Whitfield, a quiet satisfaction settling over his features despite the seriousness of the moment unfolding before them. "So my suspicion was correct after all," he murmured. "It seems so," Laura replied, her sharp eyes fixed on Elena's rigid posture, watching the young bride's carefully maintained composure crumble in real time. "I confess I did not expect the confirmation to arrive with quite this much weight behind it." "Neither did I," Owen admitted quietly, "though I suspect young Damien Cross expected precisely this outcome from the very beginning." Nearby, Victor Voss sat frozen in his own seat, his earlier confidence evaporating rapidly as the implications of the announcement settled over him. He had spent months congratulating himself on securing the greatest business arrangement of his career, and now, watching his daughter's face drain of all color before the most powerful assembly on the continent, he felt the first genuine flicker of fear he had experienced since negotiations for the marriage first began. He glanced toward Elena, desperate to catch her eye, to offer some silent reassurance, but she remained fixed in place, staring straight ahead at Alaric with an expression of dawning horror she seemed powerless to conceal. Charlotte, seated several rows back among the lesser attendants permitted to observe the proceedings, felt her stomach twist painfully as she recalled her own quiet warning delivered just days earlier in the bridal suite. She had sensed something significant lurking behind the old man's calm demeanor, had even mentioned Owen's cryptic comment about a founding elder attending in person, and Elena had dismissed the concern entirely in favor of debating gown colors. Watching the scene unfold now, Charlotte felt a heavy weight of dread settle over her, understanding with sudden clarity that no amount of charm or apology was likely to undo months of careless cruelty delivered in front of an audience that clearly remembered every single moment of it. Constance Ford called for a brief recess shortly after Alaric's opening remarks, allowing the stunned assembly a moment to absorb the weight of what had just been revealed before the council resumed formal proceedings. Elena rose unsteadily from her seat the instant the recess was announced, moving quickly toward a side corridor away from the watching eyes of the gathered dignitaries, her breathing still shallow and quick. Damien did not follow her immediately, choosing instead to remain seated, watching quietly as Nathan rose to check on her welfare, exactly as protocol and appearances required. In the quiet corridor beyond the main hall, Elena pressed her back against the cool stone wall, her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to steady her racing thoughts. Charlotte found her there moments later, having slipped away from her own seat to check on her friend. "You need to fix this," Elena said the moment Charlotte appeared, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You heard him. He's some kind of founding elder." This could ruin everything my father and I have worked toward. I told you to be careful, Charlotte said quietly, though there was no satisfaction in the reminder, only genuine concern. I told you something felt wrong about the timing of his appearances. I know what you told me, Elena snapped, then immediately softened, pressing her fingers against her temples. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my voice. I just need to think. There has to be a way to smooth this over. He seemed reasonable during our previous conversations. Maybe if I explain myself properly, apologize sincerely, he'll understand it was simply a misunderstanding. Charlotte studied her friend carefully, doubt evident in her expression. Elena, you insulted his clothing in front of 200 wedding guests. You ordered him to move furniture. You suggested, more than once, that he shouldn't have been invited to important gatherings at all. I'm not certain a simple apology is going to undo months of repeated disrespect, especially not in front of an audience that clearly already knows everything that happened. Then what do you suggest I do? Elena demanded, her composure finally cracking fully, revealing the raw fear beneath the polished confidence she had maintained for months. Sit quietly, and let my reputation, my marriage, everything my father and I have built, collapse because of a few careless comments? Charlotte had no answer to offer, watching helplessly as her friend struggled to regain some semblance of control, clearly already formulating a plan to salvage the situation through whatever means necessary. Neither of them noticed Nathan standing quietly near the corridor's entrance, having arrived moments earlier to check on Elena's welfare, now simply observing the exchange with careful, measured attention before returning to report what he had witnessed back to Damien. When the recess ended and the council reconvened, Elena returned to her seat beside Damien with her composure outwardly restored, though the fear lingering behind her eyes remained plainly visible to anyone who cared to look closely. Damien noticed it immediately, along with the subtle shift in her posture. The way she now sat slightly straighter, slightly more alert, clearly preparing herself for whatever came next. He said nothing to her directly, offering no reassurance, no comfort, no indication of what he intended to do once the proceedings resumed. He simply waited, exactly as he had waited throughout every quiet month leading up to this very moment, watching as Alaric returned to the center of the hall, ready to continue the address he had begun before the recess interrupted him. The summit had only just begun, and already, the truth Elena had spent months hoping would never surface was standing at the center of the Grand Assembly Hall, addressing the most powerful gathering of pack leaders on the entire continent. The council resumed its formal proceedings with Alaric still standing at the center of the Grand Assembly Hall, and Elena, despite her outward composure, felt the weight of every gaze in the room settling over her like a physical pressure she could not escape. She had spent the recess formulating a plan, one built on the same confident charm that had carried her through countless social gatherings throughout her life. Surely, she reasoned, if she approached the situation directly, with sincerity and grace, she could undo the damage before it spread any further. She waited for a natural pause in the proceedings, a brief moment when Constance Ford paused to consult with a fellow council member regarding procedural matters, and rose from her seat with quiet determination, moving toward the center of the hall where Alaric stood waiting for the summit to continue. Elder Thorne, she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the nearby representatives, though pitched carefully to sound humble rather than performative. I wonder if I might have a brief moment to speak with you directly, before the council continues its business. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the gathered dignitaries at her unexpected approach. Constance Ford glanced up, curious, but did not immediately object, apparently willing to allow the exchange to unfold given the unusual circumstances surrounding the morning's revelations. Alaric turned to face her fully, his expression calm and patient, exactly as it had remained throughout every single interaction they had shared over the preceding months. Of course, he said simply. Elena took a steadying breath, aware of the many eyes now fixed upon her, and began the carefully rehearsed apology she had constructed during the recess. I want to begin by saying how deeply honored I am to finally understand your true significance to this council, and to our entire pack tradition, she said, her tone warm and measured. I fear that in my ignorance of your identity, I may have said things during our previous encounters that could have been misunderstood as disrespectful. I hope you'll understand that nothing I said was ever intended with genuine unkindness. I simply didn't realize who I was speaking with. Alaric studied her for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts, though something patient and knowing lingered behind his calm gaze. I appreciate your words, he said finally, though I confess I find myself curious about something. Elena Voss. Tell me honestly, if you believe you can answer truthfully in front of this assembly, Had I truly been nothing more than an elderly relative attending your wedding out of courtesy, exactly as you believed throughout these past months, would my clothing, my manners, my simple way of living, have deserved the treatment you gave them? The hall fell silent, every representative present leaning forward slightly, sensing the significance of the question being posed. Elena hesitated, caught between the instinct to offer another polished apology and the growing awareness that Alaric's question demanded something more honest than the carefully rehearsed words she had prepared. I believe, she said slowly, choosing her words with visible care, that everyone deserves basic courtesy, regardless of their circumstances. And yet, Alaric said mildly, you offered very little courtesy to a man you believed held no influence, no wealth, and no title worth respecting. You mocked his clothing in front of 200 guests at your own engagement celebration. You ordered him to perform labor as though he were household staff, without pausing to consider whether such treatment might be inappropriate regardless of his actual position. You suggested, on more than one occasion, that his presence at important gatherings was somehow an embarrassment unworthy of the honor extended to him. He paused, his voice remaining calm and measured throughout, carrying no trace of anger despite the weight of the words themselves. I ask you again, honestly, was this simply a misunderstanding born from ignorance of my identity? Or does it reflect something deeper about how you believe people without visible status deserve to be treated? Elena's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the morning's proceedings, began finally to crack under the direct pressure of the question, the watching eyes of the entire council, and the mounting realization that no rehearsed apology was going to satisfy the deeper accusation embedded within Alaric's words. Panic, sharp and sudden, rose within her chest, and in the desperate scramble to defend herself, the careful composure she had maintained for months finally shattered entirely. With respect, Elder Thorne, she said, her voice rising slightly, an edge of frustration creeping into her tone despite her best efforts to suppress it. Perhaps if certain elderly members of this council spent less time meddling quietly in the affairs of young families, and more time being transparent about their true intentions, situations like this could be avoided entirely. It seems, frankly, a bit unfair to test someone's character through deception and then condemn them for failing an examination they never knew they were taking. The hall fell into stunned, absolute silence. Even the representatives who had sympathized quietly with Elena's earlier discomfort now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that whatever slim chance she had possessed of salvaging the moment through humility had just evaporated entirely, replaced by something far more damaging. Damien, seated in his place among the cross-family section, felt something settle within him, quiet and certain. The final piece of proof he had been waiting patiently for months to witness. This was it. This was the moment he had known, with growing certainty, would eventually arrive. Not simply another careless comment born from ignorance, easily forgiven once understanding replaced confusion. This was Elena, cornered and desperate, revealing without any remaining pretense exactly how she truly viewed the elderly, the humble, and anyone she believed held insufficient status to warrant her genuine respect. Old wolves, she had called them, meddling, she had called their quiet influence. In a single desperate sentence, spoken before the most powerful assembly on the entire continent, Elena had confirmed every single suspicion Damien had carried since the night of their engagement dinner. Alaric's expression did not change, though something quiet and final settled behind his weathered eyes, the look of a man who had witnessed exactly the outcome he had feared, but not truly doubted. Thank you, he said simply, his voice carrying no anger, only calm, measured finality. That is precisely the answer I needed to hear. Elena's face paled instantly as she realized, far too late, the magnitude of what she had just said, and the impossibility of taking the words back now that they had been spoken clearly before every senior representative of the Continental Pact Council. She glanced desperately toward Damien, searching his expression for some sign of reassurance, some indication that the moment could still somehow be salvaged. She found none. Damien's expression remained calm, composed, and utterly unreadable, the same expression he had carried since the night of their engagement dinner, watching quietly as she made mistake after mistake, waiting patiently for exactly this moment to arrive. Simon Blake was the first to break the silence that followed Elena's outburst, rising from his seat among the visiting alphas with poorly concealed eagerness. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying a practiced tone of measured concern that fooled almost no one familiar with his long-standing rivalry against the Cross family's influence. "This council has just witnessed a member of the Cross household openly disparaging a founding elder in front of the entire assembly. Surely this raises serious questions about the judgment and readiness of this new alliance to hold the influence it currently commands within the Eastern Territories. "Sit down, Simon," Owen Pierce said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This council will address the matter properly, without turning it into an opportunity for territorial maneuvering." Simon raised his hand slightly in mock surrender, though the satisfied gleam in his eyes remained plainly visible as he lowered himself back into his seat, clearly content to let the moment unfold without his direct interference now that the seed of doubt had already been planted before the assembly. Victor Voss, meanwhile, had risen halfway from his own seat, his face flushed with a desperate mixture of fear and indignation. "Elder Thorn," he began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to smoothing over difficult business negotiations through sheer force of charm. "Surely my daughter's words, spoken in a moment of understandable distress, should not be weighed too heavily against her. She is young, still learning the full weight of pack tradition. I'm certain that with proper guidance—" "Victor," Reginald Cross said quietly, cutting him off with a single measured word that carried far more authority than its brevity suggested. "This is not the moment for a father's defense. Let the council, and my son, address this matter as tradition requires." Victor's mouth closed slowly, his earlier confidence draining rapidly as he registered the quiet finality in Reginald's tone, and the realization, sharp and sudden, that his considerable business influence carried no weight whatsoever within the walls of the Grand Assembly Hall. He sank back into his seat, glancing helplessly toward his daughter, who stood alone at the center of the hall, exposed and unsupported before an audience that had, only hours earlier, gathered to celebrate her new position within one of the continent's most powerful families. Grace, seated quietly beside Nathan near the edge of the Cross family section, watched the unfolding scene with a complicated mixture of vindication and genuine sorrow. She had spent months witnessing her grandfather's patient dignity in the face of repeated disrespect, and some part of her felt a quiet satisfaction at finally seeing the truth revealed so clearly before the very people whose opinion Elena had valued above all else. And yet, watching Elena stand alone and exposed, her carefully built confidence crumbling in real time, Grace felt no genuine pleasure in the moment, only a heavy, sobering awareness of how thoroughly a person's own choices could unravel everything they had built. "She had every chance to choose differently," Nathan murmured beside her, as though sensing her conflicted thoughts. "Months of chances. She simply never took any of them." "I know," Grace said quietly. "That doesn't make it easier to watch." Constance Ford rose slowly from her seat, her expression grave as she surveyed the silent hall before her. "I believe," she said carefully, "that this council has just witnessed something significant regarding the character of someone recently joined to one of our most prominent pack families. I would ask Damien Cross, as alpha heir and husband to the young woman standing before us, whether he wishes to address this council regarding the matter." Every eye in the hall turned toward Damien, who rose slowly from his seat, his expression calm and resolute, the quiet patience of months finally giving way to the moment he had been waiting for since the very beginning. For a brief instant, before he spoke a single word, the vast hall seemed to hold its breath entirely. 200 senior representatives from across the continent waiting to see how the young alpha heir would respond to the public unraveling of the marriage he had entered only weeks earlier with such carefully measured patience. He thought, briefly, of the shattered glass at the engagement dinner, of the crates of table linens carried without complaint, of the roses in the garden and the careless words spoken beside them, of every small cruelty he had watched unfold since the very first evening he had asked Alaric to sit quietly among unsuspecting guests and simply observe. Each moment, taken alone, might have been dismissed as a minor lapse in judgment. Together, they formed a pattern no reasonable person could continue to overlook. "Yes," Damien said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I do." Elena's breath caught sharply as she watched her husband step forward to address the assembled council, understanding, with sudden and terrible clarity, that whatever he intended to say next would determine the entirety of her future within pack society. Damien walked slowly toward the center of the Grand Assembly Hall, stopping a measured distance from where Elena stood frozen, her earlier confidence now entirely replaced by visible fear. He turned first to address the full council, his voice steady and clear, carrying easily to the farthest tiered seats surrounding the central floor. 6 months ago, he began, I asked Elder Thorn for a favor that few people in this hall knew anything about until this very morning. I asked him to attend my engagement celebration disguised as an ordinary guest, an elderly family friend of no particular significance, so that I might observe how my future wife treated someone she believed held no influence over her life whatsoever. He paused, allowing the weight of the admission to settle over the silent hall. I did not do this out of cruelty or out of a desire to deceive her unfairly. I did it because my father taught me, and his father taught him before that true character reveals itself most honestly, not through grand performances made for watching crowds, but through the countless small choices we make, when we believe no one of consequence remains to witness them. He turned then to face Elena directly, his expression carrying no anger, only quiet, measured resolve. At our engagement dinner, you insulted Elder Thorne in front of 200 guests, dismissing him as unworthy of a seat at an important gathering. Weeks later, you ordered him to perform physical labor, believing him nothing more than household staff. At our pre-wedding gathering, you mocked his clothing before a crowd of onlookers. In the private garden of this very manor, you dismissed his presence entirely, suggesting he make himself useful rather than offer his opinion. And this morning, cornered by the truth of his identity, you finally revealed what I had suspected all along, that your respect for others depends entirely on the visible markers of wealth and status you were taught to recognize since childhood. Elena's eyes filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simple panic at the unraveling of her carefully constructed future, even she herself likely could not have said with certainty in that moment. "Damien," she said, her voice trembling, "please, let me explain." "I gave you 6 months to explain yourself through your actions," Damien said quietly, cutting her off, though his tone remained calm rather than cruel. 6 months of small choices, any one of which you could have made differently. I was not searching for perfection, Elena. I understand that everyone makes mistakes, that everyone occasionally speaks carelessly in a moment of frustration or misunderstanding. What I was searching for was a pattern, evidence of who you truly are beneath the polished performance you present so skillfully to those you believe matter. And the pattern I found was consistent, repeated, and finally confirmed beyond any doubt this very morning, in front of the entire Continental Pack Council. He turned back toward the assembled representatives, his voice growing steadier still. Pack tradition holds that leadership carries responsibility toward every wolf within our territories, regardless of their visible status, their wealth, or their position within our social hierarchy. A leader who cannot extend basic respect and dignity toward an elderly stranger she believes holds no power over her future will not extend it, in time, toward the countless ordinary families depending on her judgment and compassion once she holds actual authority over their lives. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the silent hall. "I invoke, before this council, the ancestral clause governing dissolution of union on grounds of demonstrated dishonor toward pack elders, a clause established generations ago specifically to protect the integrity of leadership within our territories." A collective murmur swept through the gathered dignitaries at the invocation of a clause so rarely used that many of the younger representatives present had never witnessed it applied in their lifetimes. Constance Ford rose slowly, her expression grave but resolute. "The council recognizes the invocation," she said formally. "Elder Thorne, given that you are the offended party in this matter, tradition requires your testimony before this clause can be formally upheld." Alaric stepped forward once more, his expression calm, though something quietly sorrowful lingered behind his weathered features as he regarded Elena directly. "I bear this young woman no personal ill will," he said. "I have lived long enough to understand that people are shaped by countless forces beyond their control, and I do not believe cruelty toward myself, specifically, warrants the ending of a marriage on its own merits." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "But I did not attend these gatherings simply to protect my own dignity, easily weathered after a lifetime of far greater challenges. I attended because Damien Cross asked me to help him understand whether the woman he intended to lead beside him would extend genuine respect and compassion toward every wolf within his care, or only toward those she believed could offer her something valuable in return. What I witnessed, repeated consistently across 6 months and multiple gatherings, confirms that the pattern is neither incidental nor born from simple ignorance. It reflects a fundamental understanding of power and worth that I believe would prove deeply harmful if allowed to shape leadership over territories filled with families who depend entirely on their alpha's fairness and compassion." He turned to address the full council directly. "I support the invocation of the ancestral clause, not out of personal grievance, but out of genuine concern for the wolves who would eventually fall under this young woman's authority, should this union be permitted to continue unchallenged." Constance Ford nodded slowly, her expression carrying the weight of a decision she clearly understood would echo throughout Pack territories for years to come. "The council has heard both the invocation and the testimony supporting it," she said. "Are there any among this assembly who wish to speak against the dissolution?" Silence stretched across the hall. Even Simon Blake, who might once have relished any opportunity to weaken the Cross family's standing, remained silent, recognizing perhaps that opposing such a clear demonstration of poor character would serve no useful purpose for his own reputation among the watching council. Then the council formally recognizes the dissolution of union between Damien Cross and Elena Voss, effective immediately, on grounds of demonstrated dishonor toward a founding elder of this council, Constance announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Elena Voss shall retain no claim to title or authority within the Cross family territories from this moment forward. Elena stood motionless at the center of the hall, the full weight of the council's decision settling over her with crushing finality. Everything she had worked toward, every ambition her father had cultivated within her since childhood, every carefully performed gesture of grace and confidence she had maintained throughout the preceding months, had unraveled entirely in the span of a single morning, undone not by any single dramatic failure, but by the slow, patient accumulation of small cruelties she had never believed anyone of consequence was watching closely enough to notice. Victor Voss rose from his seat, his expression a mixture of devastation and barely suppressed anger, though he said nothing further, understanding with sudden clarity that any additional protest would only further damage whatever remained of his family's standing before the assembled dignitaries. Damien remained standing at the center of the hall, watching quietly as Elena finally lowered her gaze, tears now falling freely down her cheeks, the composed confidence she had carried since the very first day of their arranged engagement entirely stripped away, leaving only the raw, unguarded truth of a woman who had spent months believing her cruelty carried no cost, only to discover, far too late, that every small choice she made had been carefully observed, remembered, and ultimately weighed against her by the very people whose respect she had claimed to value most. The Grand Assembly Hall remained silent as Elena was quietly escorted from the central floor by two attendants, her father following close behind, the weight of the morning's revelations settling heavily over every representative who had witnessed the dissolution unfold in real time before them. Constance Ford called for a formal recess to allow the council time to absorb the significance of what had just transpired, before proceeding with the remainder of the summit's business. As the hall slowly emptied into smaller clusters of quiet conversation, Damien made his way toward a private antechamber adjoining the main assembly, where Reginald and Alaric soon joined him, the three of them settling into a rare moment of stillness after months of careful, patient waiting. "You handled that with more restraint than I believe I could have managed at your age," Reginald said, studying his son carefully. "There was no satisfaction in it," Damien admitted quietly, sinking into one of the antechamber's simple wooden chairs. "I expected to feel some sense of relief once the truth finally surfaced. Instead, I mostly feel tired." "That is often the way of difficult decisions made correctly," Alaric said, settling into the chair across from him. "Satisfaction belongs to decisions made carelessly, out of anger or wounded pride. What you did today was neither. You allowed the truth to reveal itself patiently, without manipulation, without cruelty of your own, and you accepted the council's judgment, rather than imposing your will unilaterally. That distinction matters a great deal, Damien, both for your own conscience and for how this pack's future leadership will be remembered." Reginald nodded slowly in agreement, his weathered features carrying the quiet pride of a father watching his son navigate exactly the kind of difficult judgment that pack leadership demanded. "The Voss trade alliance will likely collapse within the week," he observed. "Victor built his entire strategy around this marriage. Without it, I suspect several of his northern trade partners will reconsider their existing agreements rather quickly." "That was never the point of today," Damien said. "I didn't do this to damage the Voss family's business standing." "No," Alaric agreed. "But consequences rarely limit themselves neatly to the intentions behind the actions that cause them. Victor built his fortune on the assumption that this union would secure influence he had not earned through his own patient effort. Watching that assumption collapse is simply the natural result of a foundation built on convenience rather than genuine partnership." The three of them sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the morning settling comfortably into something closer to calm reflection now that the most difficult portion of the ordeal had passed. Nathan appeared in the antechamber doorway a few minutes later, Grace close behind him, both of them clearly having slipped away from the reconvening assembly to check on Damien's welfare. "How are you holding up?" Nathan asked, studying his friend carefully. "Better than I expected," Damien admitted. "Though I imagine the coming weeks will bring their own share of complications. The council will need to address the territorial arrangements that were tied to the marriage. Simon Blake will likely attempt to exploit whatever uncertainty follows." "Let him try," Nathan said firmly. You've just demonstrated exactly the kind of patient, principled leadership this council respects most. I doubt Simon will find much traction attempting to undermine that so soon after everyone witnessed it firsthand. Grace, standing quietly near the doorway, met Damien's eyes briefly, something warm and genuine passing between them, that neither of them acknowledged directly in front of the others. For what it's worth, she said softly, my grandfather rarely extends this kind of trust to anyone outside our immediate family. The fact that he agreed to help you test her character at all says a great deal about the respect he's developed for your judgment over these past months. I'm grateful for it, Damien said, glancing toward Alaric with genuine warmth. None of this would have been possible without your patience. Patience is simply the willingness to wait for truth to reveal itself naturally, Alaric said, waving off the gratitude with characteristic humility. You supplied the courage necessary to act on what that truth eventually showed you. That courage matters just as much as the patience that preceded it. The recess drew to a close shortly after, and the four of them made their way back toward the main assembly hall, where the Continental Pack Council prepared to resume its formal business, the morning's dramatic revelations now woven permanently into the recorded history of the summit's proceedings. Whatever challenges lay ahead for Damien, whatever territorial complications would need careful navigation in the coming weeks, he walked back into that hall with a quiet, settled certainty that had been entirely absent from his life since the day his father first informed him of the arranged engagement so many months earlier. 3 months passed following the summit's dramatic conclusion, and Blackthorn Manor gradually settled into a quieter, steadier rhythm than it had known throughout the turbulent weeks surrounding Damien's brief marriage. The Voss trade alliance had indeed collapsed within weeks of the dissolution, exactly as Reginald had predicted, several of Victor's longtime northern partners quietly withdrawing their agreements once word of the council's judgment spread throughout the territories. Elena herself had retreated from public pack society entirely, moving to a distant property her father maintained along the southern coast, far removed from the world of territorial politics and council summits that had once seemed destined to define her future. Damien heard occasional updates about her circumstances through the same network of gossip and observation that had first revealed her true character, though he found himself feeling less satisfaction in her downfall than he might have expected months earlier. There was no cruelty in his heart toward her, only a quiet, settled understanding that some patterns, left unaddressed, would have caused far greater harm had they been allowed to continue unchecked within a position of genuine authority. The manor itself had become, in the months since the summit, a livelier and more welcoming place than it had been throughout the anxious weeks of wedding preparations. Alaric had chosen to remain at Blackthorn following the council's proceedings, citing a renewed interest in mentoring the region's younger leadership after decades of quiet retirement. His presence brought a steady stream of visiting dignitaries seeking his counsel, filling the manor's halls with the kind of thoughtful, purposeful energy that had been entirely absent during Elena's brief tenure as its mistress. Grace, too, had extended her stay considerably beyond what anyone initially anticipated, assisting her grandfather with his renewed responsibilities while gradually becoming an indispensable presence within the household's daily operations. She possessed none of Elena's polished ambition, choosing instead a quiet, genuine warmth that extended equally to household staff, visiting elders, and senior council members alike, treating every person she encountered with the same measured respect, regardless of their visible status or influence. It was on a crisp autumn evening, nearly identical in temperature and clear skies to the night of Damien's original engagement dinner so many months earlier, that Nathan found his friend standing once again at the tall windows overlooking the training yard, though this time his expression carried none of the careful calculation that had defined those earlier months of quiet observation. "You've been standing here a while," Nathan observed, joining him at the window. "Just thinking," Damien said. "About Elena?" "No," Damien admitted, a small, genuine smile touching his features for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. "About how strange it feels to finally have nothing left to watch for. No pattern to track, no test quietly unfolding beneath the surface of every conversation, just an ordinary evening." Nathan chuckled softly. "That sounds like a rather welcome change, given the past year." "It is," Damien agreed. Below them, in the training yard, Grace had appeared, walking alongside two of the household's younger wolves, offering quiet guidance as they practiced their evening drills beneath the fading light. She laughed at something one of them said, the sound carrying faintly up through the open window, warm and unguarded in a way Damien found himself appreciating more with each passing week. "You've been spending a fair amount of time with her," Nathan said, following his friend's gaze with a knowing expression. "She's easy to talk to," Damien said simply. "She never performs for an audience the way Elena always seemed to." What you see with Grace is exactly what exists underneath, whether anyone important is watching or not. Alaric seems to approve of the friendship, Nathan noted. I've caught him smiling more than once when the two of you were in the same room. Damien said nothing further, though the small, genuine smile remained on his features as he continued watching the training yard below, where Grace had finished her instruction and was making her way back toward the manor, glancing up briefly toward the tall windows as she approached, offering a small wave when she noticed Damien watching. Later that evening, the three of them, Damien, Alaric and Grace, gathered once more in the manor's private library, the same quiet room where so many of the past year's careful conversations had unfolded during the anxious months of testing and observation. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm, flickering light across the tall shelves of ancient texts lining the walls. The council has asked me to consider a permanent advisory position, Alaric mentioned, settling into his usual chair. Something to help guide the newer generation of pack leadership more directly than my previous years of quiet retirement allowed. Will you accept? Damien asked. I believe I will, Alaric said, glancing briefly toward his granddaughter with quiet warmth. It seems this old wolf has found reason to remain engaged with the world a bit longer than he originally intended. Grace smiled, reaching over to rest her hand, briefly on her grandfather's arm. I think that's a wonderful decision, she said. Though I suspect you already knew that before mentioning it to us. Perhaps, Alaric admitted, a faint twinkle of humor lighting his weathered features. Though I find it valuable to hear such decisions spoken aloud among those I trust, rather than simply deciding them quietly on my own. Damien watched the easy warmth between grandfather and granddaughter with quiet appreciation, understanding, perhaps for the first time since his own difficult year began, exactly what genuine partnership and mutual respect actually looked like when built on something more substantial than convenient arrangement or performed affection. There's something I've been considering as well, Damien said finally, drawing both their attention. The council will need to discuss the territorial matters left unresolved since the dissolution. I intend to propose new guidelines regarding how future unions within pack leadership are evaluated, guidelines that place greater emphasis on demonstrated character rather than strategic alliance alone. A wise proposal, Alaric said approvingly. Though I imagine some among the council will resist such changes, particularly those who have long benefited from arrangements built purely on strategic convenience. Let them resist, Damien said, echoing the same quiet confidence he had carried throughout the difficult months leading up to the summit. I've learned this past year that patience, applied correctly, eventually reveals the truth clearly enough that resistance becomes difficult to sustain. I intend to apply that same patience toward building something better for this pack's future, regardless of how long it takes to convince the more stubborn voices within the council. Grace studied him thoughtfully for a long moment, something warm and genuine passing across her expression. You've changed a great deal since the night of your engagement dinner, she observed. The man I first heard about through my grandfather's letters seemed far more guarded, far more focused on careful calculation than the person sitting across from me now. Perhaps, Damien admitted, though I suspect the change has as much to do with the people surrounding me now as it does with anything I've learned on my own. He glanced briefly toward Alaric, gratitude evident in his expression, before returning his attention to Grace. Watching genuine character, patiently and consistently demonstrated, taught me a great deal about what I actually want to build for this pack's future. Not simply territory and influence, but a household, and eventually a leadership, built on the same quiet respect and honesty I've witnessed between the two of you. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as the conversation drifted into comfortable silence, the three of them settling into the easy companionship that had grown steadily throughout the months following the summit's dramatic conclusion. Outside the tall library windows, the autumn evening deepened into night, the training yard below finally quiet after the day's activities. The manor itself settled into the kind of peaceful stillness it had rarely known during the anxious months surrounding Damien's brief, arranged marriage. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the northern hills in a soft layer of frost that transformed the manor grounds into something quiet and pristine. Damien found himself walking the garden paths one crisp morning, the same paths where Alaric had once endured Elena's careless dismissal among the roses, now dusted lightly with the season's first frost. Grace joined him partway through his walk, her breath visible in the cold morning air, a warm scarf wrapped snugly around her shoulders. Henry mentioned the northern border patrols have been fully restored to their original strength, she said, falling into step beside him. He seemed relieved to finally have proper staffing again, without needing to fight for it. That's one small correction among many, Damien said. though I suspect it will take considerably longer to repair some of the trust that was strained during those difficult months. Trust rebuilds faster than people often expect, Grace said, provided the person doing the rebuilding demonstrates consistency rather than simply promising it. She glanced sideways at him, a small, knowing smile touching her features. You've been remarkably consistent these past months, Damien. Henry trusts you. The border captains trust you. Even the household staff who once tiptoed carefully around Elena's unpredictable moods have settled into something far more comfortable under your direct leadership. I've had good examples to follow, Damien said, glancing toward her with quiet warmth. They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, passing beneath the bare branches of the garden's old oak trees, until they reached the small stone bench overlooking the frost-covered rose bushes where Alaric had once stood so calmly against Elena's careless words. Do you ever think about her? Grace asked eventually, settling onto the bench beside him. Elena, I mean. Damien considered the question honestly before answering. Occasionally, he admitted. Not with anger, not anymore. Mostly I think about how differently things might have unfolded if she had simply chosen kindness even once, when she believed it cost her nothing to withhold it. I don't know whether she's found any genuine reflection in the months since the summit, or whether she still believes the entire situation was simply unfair deception on my part. I suppose I'll likely never know for certain. Does it matter, either way? Grace asked gently. No, Damien said, after a thoughtful pause. I don't believe it does. Whatever she chooses to understand from this, or refuses to understand, belongs entirely to her own path now. My responsibility was never to shape her character, only to discover honestly what it already was before placing the well-being of an entire pack's territories into her hands. Grace nodded slowly, understanding settling comfortably between them, as the morning sun began breaking gently through the thinning frost, warming the quiet garden around them. My grandfather told me once that the wolves who learn the most from difficult lessons are rarely the ones the lesson was originally meant to teach, she said. Sometimes the lesson simply passes forward, quietly, to whoever happens to be paying close enough attention to receive it. Damien glanced at her, something warm and genuine settling behind his eyes. And what lesson did you take from all of this? Grace considered the question seriously before answering. That genuine character rarely announces itself loudly, she said. It reveals itself patiently, consistently, in the small, quiet choices nobody else is watching closely enough to notice. And that the people worth building a life alongside are usually the ones who treat every person around them, regardless of status or usefulness, with the same steady respect they extend to those who could benefit them the most. Damien said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her thoughtfully in the soft morning light, before finally offering a small, genuine smile of his own. That sounds like wisdom worth building an entire future around, he said quietly. Grace held his gaze steadily, understanding passing unspoken between them, warm and unhurried, entirely unlike the careful calculation and quiet testing that had defined so much of the preceding year. I rather think it does, she agreed softly. They sat together on the frost-touched bench a while longer, watching the morning light slowly warm the quiet garden around them. Two people who had found, through the patient unraveling of one difficult year, exactly the kind of genuine partnership neither of them had expected to discover so unexpectedly close to home. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the council summit and the quiet, patient testing that preceded it became something of a lesson passed down among the region's pack families, a reminder that true character reveals itself most honestly in the smallest, quietest moments, when no audience remains to witness the choice being made. Damien Cross went on to lead his territories with the same patient wisdom he had learned to value so deeply throughout that difficult year, building alongside him, in time, a partnership grounded in genuine respect rather than strategic convenience. And somewhere along the northern hills, in the same modest home he had occupied for decades before Damien's letter first arrived asking for his quiet assistance, Alaric Thorne continued watching the world of pack politics unfold, patient as ever, confident that the lessons learned through one young alpha's difficult year would echo forward through generations of leadership still to come.